Hey there, tonight we're diving into the turbulent canals of medieval Venice, where the allure of masked balls meets the harsh reality of navigating plague-ridden alleyways and cutthroat politics. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. As the first rays of sun tiptoe over the Venetian lagoon, the scent of salt and spices wafts through your open window, jolting you awake. Welcome to medieval Venice, where the city never sleeps, and neither will you. Forget the gondolas and serenades. This is a world fueled by trade, not romance. You're in the Rialto market, the beating heart of Venice's economic empire, long before the tourist hordes traded their euros for gelato. Down here, merchants in woolen tunics bustle like ants, orchestrating a symphony of deals that echo across continents. It's 1423, and Venice is the pivot point between the East and the West, a city where silk, spices, and salt flow like lifeblood. The numbers are staggering. Venice handles around 2,000 tons of goods annually, with spices alone accounting for a chunk of that. Imagine a world without pepper or cinnamon. That's the kind of culinary apocalypse the Venetians are saving you from. As you dodge a cart loaded with barrels of salt, nicknamed white gold for good reason, you start to grasp the scale of this operation. Salt isn't just for seasoning. It preserves food, a necessity in a world without refrigeration. The Venetian government, the mighty Serenissima, controls the salt trade with an iron fist, monopolizing its distribution and making sure every grain lines the city's coffers. You've got to admire their business acumen, even if it's a bit Machiavellian. Speaking of business, check out that merchant over there, haggling over a shipment of silk. Silk is the Rolls-Royce of fabrics, luxurious, expensive, and worth its weight in ducats. Venetian traders travel as far as the Byzantine Empire and beyond, bringing back shimmering bolts of fabric that transform the wardrobes of Europe's elite. These traders are the original globetrotters, navigating perilous seas and desert caravans to secure their fortunes. Think Marco Polo, but with less fanfare and more ledger books. But let's not romanticize these seafaring merchants too much. Behind every epic trade journey lies a web of politics, alliances, and let's be honest, a bit of piracy. The Venetian Navy, boasting around 300 ships at its height, patrols the Mediterranean like a maritime mafia, ensuring their trade routes remain unchallenged. They're the bouncers at the club, making sure nobody crashes the Venetian party without an invite or a hefty toll. As you wander deeper into the market, the din of voices grows louder, a cacophony of dialects and tongues that underscores Venice's cosmopolitan nature. This is a city of immigrants and outcasts, where Greeks, Jews, Arabs, and Germans rub shoulders, each adding their unique flavor to the Venetian melting pot. It's a place where a Greek trader can haggle with a Jewish moneylender, and an Arab spice merchant can share a laugh with a German beer brewer. Its multiculturalism before it was cool, driven not by utopian ideals, but by cold, hard cash. And speaking of cash, let's talk numbers. A pound of black pepper might set you back about 2 ducats, a small fortune given that a skilled craftsman earns maybe 100 ducats a year. These spices aren't just for making your stew taste better, they're symbols of wealth and status, the medieval equivalent of driving a souped-up sports car. In a world where food is often bland, a sprinkle of exotic spice is like sprinkling gold dust on your dinner. As morning stretches toward noon, the market teems with life. You notice the Doge Palace in the distance, a reminder that all roads, or rather canals, lead back to Venice's ruling elite. The Doge may wear fancy robes and a snazzy hat, but make no mistake, he's more CEO than monarch, overseeing a republic that runs on trade, diplomacy, and the occasional bit of skullduggery. It's no accident that Venice has been dubbed La Serenissima, the most serene. The city's leaders have mastered the art of balancing power and profit, often at the expense of peace. By now, your senses are on overload, bombarded by the sights, sounds, and smells of the Rialto. But that's Venice for you. a city that thrives on controlled chaos, where every transaction is a step in the dance of commerce. It's a place where money talks, and it's speaking fluent Venetian. So, as you navigate this whirlwind of activity, remember, Venice's romantic veneer might dazzle, but it's the gritty reality of trade and commerce that keeps the city afloat. Tomorrow, there will be new deals, new fortunes made and lost. But today, you've got a front row seat to the greatest economic show on earth. Keep your purse strings tight and your wits sharper. It's all part of surviving a day in medieval Venice. As you step out of the bustling Rialto market, it's time to explore the real Venice, the labyrinth of narrow streets, twisting canals, and hidden squares that make up this aquatic metropolis. Forget about any romantic notions of leisurely gondola rides under a moonlit sky. Navigating medieval Venice is more like trying to find your way out of an Escher painting. The city is a puzzling mosaic of over 100 islands connected by approximately 400 bridges, each with its own story and purpose. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone ever made it to their destination without Google Maps. Now, let's talk about those canals. The Venetians didn't just dig a few ditches and call it a day. No, they engineered a comprehensive network of waterways that served as the lifeblood of the city. The Grand Canal, the city's main artery, snakes through Venice in a lazy S-shape, stretching nearly 2 miles and wide enough to accommodate the bustling traffic of merchant ships, gondolas, and the occasional floating corpse. Yes, I said corpse. You see, the canals also doubled as a convenient dumping ground for all sorts of waste, both organic and otherwise. Picture the medieval equivalent of a clogged drain, but on a city-wide scale. And before you ask, yes, it did smell. Venetians had to deal with the pungent aroma of stagnant water, rotting waste, and fishy undertones on a daily basis. It's enough to make you grateful for modern sewage systems, isn't it? But despite the olfactory assault, these canals were essential. They provided a means of transport, a water supply, and even a defensive barrier against invaders. After all, if you wanted to conquer Venice, you'd first have to navigate its watery maze, which was easier said than done when you're wearing heavy armor and can't swim. Speaking of defense, the geography of Venice was as much about keeping enemies out as it was about keeping the city in one piece. During the Middle Ages, the city's strategic position in the shallow Venetian lagoon was a natural deterrent against would-be invaders. The lagoon itself is a sprawling, marshy expanse of water dotted with tiny islands, making it difficult for enemy ships to approach unnoticed, kind of like trying to sneak up on a porcupine. And if you somehow managed to get past the lagoon's natural defenses, you were met with fortified walls, armed galleys, and a citizenry that wasn't afraid to fight for its home. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the water, flooding. Living in a city built on water has its perks, but it also comes with the constant threat of flooding. Imagine waking up one morning to find your living room ankle-deep in lagoon water. Welcome to Aqua Alta, or high water, a phenomenon that Venetians have been dealing with for centuries. Back in the day, the city relied on a series of wooden pilings driven into the mud to support its buildings. These pilings, combined with the natural sedimentation of the lagoon, created a somewhat stable foundation. But as you can imagine, nothing lasts forever, and Venice's relationship with water has always been a precarious dance. When the tide rose, streets and squares turned into temporary canals, and poor Venetians had to wade through the water to go about their daily business. It's no wonder that many homes were built with raised ground floors or access stairs leading to upper levels, the medieval version of flood insurance. And while the Aqua Alta was certainly inconvenient, it wasn't all bad news. The floods helped flush out the canals, clearing away some of the accumulated muck and debris. Silver linings, right. But let's not get carried away with the romance of the cityscape. Life in Venice was far from a picturesque postcard, those charming bridges you see today. Back then, they were rudimentary wooden structures, often without railings, making them more of a death trap than a scenic crossing. Venetian bridges were built for practicality, not aesthetics, designed to withstand the foot traffic of a bustling city rather than offer a pretty view. And if you manage to cross one without falling in, consider it a small victory. The city's infrastructure was a marvel of medieval engineering, a testament to the ingenuity and tenacity of its people. But it was also a constant reminder of the harsh realities of living in such an extraordinary place. For every breathtaking view and architectural wonder, there was an equal measure of danger and decay lurking just below the surface. Navigating Venice wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a test of your wits and resilience. As you meander through the narrow alleys, dodging puddles and the occasional rat, you can't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of it all. A city built on water, defying nature and logic, thriving in spite of every obstacle. It's a testament to human perseverance, a reminder that beauty often comes at a price. And if nothing else, it makes for one heck of a story to tell over dinner. So, as you wander this aquatic labyrinth, remember, Venice may dazzle with its romantic allure, but it's the grit and grime that tell the true tale of a city that refused to sink. There's more to explore and even more to uncover. But for now, take a deep breath, preferably away from the canals, and soak in the reality of medieval Venice, warts and all. Keep your feet dry and your sense of humor intact. You'll need both to survive another day in this magnificent, maddening city. But let's put those soggy socks aside for a moment and dive into a different kind of Venetian experience. Lunchtime. You might think the medieval Venetian table was groaning under the weight of exotic dishes and overflowing goblets. But let's pop that bubble of opulence. The truth is, your average Venetian's midday meal was more about sustenance than splendor. Picture yourself seated at a modest wooden table, the air filled with the chatter of the bustling city. Forget about silver platters and succulent roasts. What you're more likely to find is a bowl of polenta or a chunk of bread made from millet or barley. Wheat bread, that's reserved for the wealthy, an edible status symbol for those with deep pockets. Your meal might be accompanied by a bit of fish if you were lucky. After all, this is Venice, a city practically swimming in seafood. But don't expect a lavish seafood spread. Fish, like sardines or anchovies, was often dried or salted, making it more of a practical choice than a luxurious one. And while we're at it, let's debunk another myth. The Venetian table was surprisingly devoid of some foods we can't imagine living without today. Tomatoes. Nope, not here yet. Potatoes. Forget it. Chocolate. Dream on. Even sugar was a luxury, used sparingly and valued almost as much as gold. Instead, your typical sweetener would be honey or, if you were really in the money, a bit of imported sugar from Cyprus. Now, let's talk about the social customs of dining because, believe it or not, eating wasn't just about the food. It was a social ritual, a dance of etiquette and hierarchy. The wealthy would recline at long tables, indulging in the pomp of multiple courses, while servants flitted about like bees in a hive. The poor, meanwhile, made do with what they could and often dined in communal settings. It was a society where even the act of eating reflected your place in the social pecking order. Dining was also a communal event, often shared with family or friends. The notion of eating alone was as foreign as a peppercorn from India. Meals were an opportunity to bond, discuss business, or perhaps gossip about the latest scandal involving the Doge. And if you were dining with someone of higher status, remember your table manners, an art form in itself with rules as complex as a Venetian tapestry. Don't reach across the table, chew quietly, and for heaven's sake, use your knife and fingers with some grace. Forks, those nifty tools wouldn't become common until much later. For those who could afford it, wine was the beverage of choice. But let's not confuse medieval wine with the robust vintages we sip today. This was often a diluted concoction, more about drinking something safer than the questionable water supply than getting a buzz. For the less affluent, ale or cider was the go-to, providing a bit of refreshment after a morning of hard labor or haggling at the market. And let's not forget the seasoning that made every dish just a bit more bearable: spices. They were the bling of the culinary world, adding not only flavor, but also a dash of prestige to any meal. A pinch of cinnamon or a sprinkle of saffron told your guests you had connections, possibly even as far-reaching as the spice markets of the East. It was a taste of the exotic, a reminder of Venice's status as a global trading power. The disparity between the rich and the working classes was as stark at the table as it was in the streets. While the elite dined on multiple courses, perhaps indulging in a peacock pie or a swan roast for special occasions, the masses filled up on simple fare. Yet, despite the simplicity, there was an appreciation for the communal aspect of dining that transcended class divides. Food was sustenance, yes, but it was also a shared experience, a temporary escape from the daily grind. So, as you finish your humble meal, take a moment to appreciate the flavors and the stories that come with them. Venice's culinary scene might not have been the sumptuous feast of legend, but it was a microcosm of the city's broader socio-economic landscape. Every bite was a reminder of Venice's intricate dance between commerce, culture, and community. As you wipe your hands on your tunic and prepare to re-enter the bustling streets, keep in mind the layers of history embedded in every morsel you've tasted. It's a meal that speaks not just of survival, but of a vibrant, complex society where every grain of salt was a testament to the city's far-reaching influence. There's more to uncover in this enigmatic city, more stories that echo through its canals and whispers that linger in its alleyways. But for now, let the flavors linger on your palate as you step back into the living tapestry that is medieval Venice, ready for whatever adventure awaits in the afternoon sun. As you step back into the living tapestry of medieval Venice, ready for whatever adventure awaits in the afternoon sun, let's take a detour from the twisting alleys and shifting canals right into the heart of the Venetian political beast. And what a beast it is. If you think today's politics are a tangled mess of alliances and agendas, you haven't waded through the murky waters of the Venetian Republic. Welcome to the intricate web of councils, committees, and conspiracies that make up the Serenissima's political landscape. A scene so complex, even Machiavelli would need a flowchart. At the helm of this Byzantine bureaucracy sits the Doge, the closest thing Venice has to a monarch. But don't let the fancy title fool you. The Doge is more figurehead than king, a puppet in a gilded cage with strings pulled by the city's true power players. Elected for life, the Doge wears his ceremonial hat, a corno ducale, if you're taking notes, and presides over a republic that functions more like a corporate boardroom than a royal court. Think of him as the CEO of Venice, Inc., with a job description that includes keeping the peace, bolstering trade, and generally avoiding any scandal that might land him in the history books for the wrong reasons. If you're imagining a medieval version of a corporate retreat gone wrong, you're not far off. Beneath the Doge's poised exterior lies a political machine engineered to prevent any one man from seizing total control. Because, let's be honest, nobody wants a power-hungry tyrant mucking up the delicate balance of a city built on commerce and cunning. Enter the Great Council, a sprawling assembly of around 2,000 noblemen who meet in the lavish halls of the Palazzo Ducale. This is no cozy fireside chat. It's a legislative marathon, where decisions are made by consensus, compromise, and the occasional bit of coercion. Then there's the Senate, a more exclusive club of about 300, tasked with handling foreign affairs and trade negotiations. Imagine a room full of Venetian diplomats, each jockeying for position, their agendas hidden behind layers of political maneuvering. It's like an episode of Game of Thrones meets the West Wing, with fewer dragons but just as much intrigue. But the real power behind the scenes belongs to the Council of 10, a shadowy group that could give modern intelligence agencies a run for their money. Established in 1310, the Council of 10 is the ultimate political watchdog, tasked with protecting the state from internal and external threats. Think of them as the unsmiling enforcers of Venice's fragile peace, wielding a level of secrecy that would make even the CIA blush. This council is notorious for its heavy-handed approach to justice, often operating in the shadows, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. Need to silence a political opponent? The Council of Ten's got your back. Suspect a foreign spy is snooping around the Rialto. Consider it handled. Their methods are swift, and let's say, not exactly bound by the rule of law. Rumor has it they have their own network of spies and informers scattered throughout the city, keeping tabs on anyone and everyone who might pose a threat to the status quo. It's a world where paranoia is as common as pasta, and trust is about as rare as a sunny day in a Venetian winter. Secret trials, anonymous accusations, and midnight disappearances are all part of the package. If you're thinking this sounds like a medieval version of House of Cards, you're spot on. The Council of 10 is a political thriller waiting to be written, complete with cloak and dagger drama and a soundtrack by Vivaldi. Now, let's not forget about the other players in this political chess game. The Quarantia, or the Forty, is a council responsible for matters of justice and civil law. These guys are the legal eagles of Venice, ensuring that the gears of government turn smoothly, or at least appear to. They're the ones you'd call if you found yourself on the wrong side of a legal dispute, assuming you could afford their services. And then there's the minor council, a small group of advisors to the Doge, who act as his cabinet of sorts. They're the ones whispering in his ear, steering him away from potential pitfalls and nudging him toward decisions that align with their interests. If you're imagining a medieval version of Yes, Minister, complete with convoluted schemes and bureaucratic red tape, you've got the right picture. All these councils and committees form an intricate lattice of power and influence, a delicate balance that keeps Venice from imploding under the weight of its own ambition. It's a system designed to prevent any one faction from gaining too much control, a political tightrope walk that the city's leaders have perfected over centuries. But why all the secrecy and intrigue, you ask? Well, Venice's strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia makes it a prime target for espionage and sabotage. Rival city-states, foreign powers, and even the Pope have their eyes on this aquatic jewel, each eager to tip the scales in their favor. The Venetian Republic knows that its survival depends on staying one step ahead, a game of political chess where the stakes are nothing less than the city's independence. So as you stroll through the bustling streets, remember that behind every ornate facade and every whispering canal lies a world of political complexity that rivals any modern drama. Venice isn't just a city of romance and gondolas. It's a living testament to the art of political survival, where every decision is a calculated move in a never-ending game of power and prestige. And who knows, maybe as you weave through this labyrinth of history, you'll catch a glimpse of the Doge himself, pondering the next move in this grand chessboard of intrigue. Just don't get too close. In a city where secrets are currency, you never know who might be watching. As you weave through the labyrinth of history and intrigue, you might think you've seen all that medieval Venice has to offer. But let's make a detour from the political chess game and step into the world of Venetian artisans, craftsmen who, believe it or not, were the rock stars of their day. We're talking about people who could make glass that seemed spun from moonlight and fabrics that shimmered like the sea at dawn. Welcome to the workshops, where the magic and the nitty-gritty of Venice truly comes to life. First stop, the glassblowers of Murano. Picture a group of artisans who are equal parts scientist and sorcerer, wielding molten glass like it's an extension of their very being. By the 14th century, Murano had become the epicenter for glassmaking, thanks to a strategic move by the Venetians to banish all glass furnaces to the island to prevent fires from turning the city into a medieval bonfire. Talk about a hot topic. But this wasn't just about fire safety. Murano's isolation helped protect trade secrets, because who wants competitors stealing their glass-blowing mojo? These artisans crafted everything from simple beads to elaborate chandeliers that could rival the night sky. It wasn't just about skill, it was about innovation. They pioneered techniques like crystalline glass and even came up with a way to make glass mirrors, which, before Murano, were as rare as a day without rain in the Venetian winter. In a world where mirrors were a luxury item, Murano's artisans had every noble in Europe clamoring for a peek at their reflection. But let's not romanticize it too much. These glassmakers were bound by strict guild regulations that dictated every aspect of their work, from the materials they used to the designs they could create. The Guild of Glassmakers wasn't just a professional association. It was a regulatory body that could make or break a career. If you thought modern-day patents were a hassle, try navigating a medieval guild system where stepping out of line could cost you your livelihood. Speaking of guilds, the textile industry was no less intense. Venice was renowned for its luxurious textiles, especially its silk, which was as coveted as a Kardashian Instagram post. Silk weaving was an art form passed down through generations, with workshops operating like well-oiled machines. Picture rows of looms, each operated by artisans whose fingers danced over threads to create patterns that looked like they were plucked from a dream. Yet, the reality was far from dreamy. These weavers worked under the constant watch of the Guild of Silk Weavers, which had more rules than a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Every piece of fabric was scrutinized to ensure it met the Guild's exacting standards, and woe betide anyone who tried to cut corners. And let's not even get started on the working conditions. Long hours, low pay, and the kind of back-breaking labor that made even the most resilient weaver reconsider their career choices. Economic pressures were as much a part of the artisan's life as the tools of their trade. The demand for Venetian goods was high, but so were the taxes and fees levied by the Serenissima to keep the city's coffers full. Artisans found themselves caught in a web of financial obligations, each ducat they earned already spoken for by the time it hit their palm. It was a world where creativity had to dance a delicate tango with economic survival. And let's not forget the apprentices, young hopefuls who entered workshops with dreams of mastering a craft, only to find themselves doing grunt work, sweeping floors, fetching supplies, and generally being at the beck and call of their masters. They were the medieval equivalent of unpaid interns. But for those who persevered, the reward was a place among the skilled craftsmen of Venice, a fraternity that was both exclusive and revered. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of Venetian craftsmanship, it's clear that the artisans of Venice weren't just creating goods. They were weaving the very fabric of the city's identity. Their work was a testament to human ingenuity, a blend of art and science that left a legacy as enduring as the canals themselves. Venice's artisanal industries weren't just about objects. They were about stories, of struggle, of innovation, and of a city that knew how to turn adversity into advantage. In today's world, the legacy of medieval Venice lives on. From the glassblowers of Murano who still craft masterpieces to the fashion houses that draw inspiration from centuries-old textiles, Venice's influence is undeniable. It's a reminder that creativity often thrives under constraints, that sometimes the most beautiful art emerges from the most challenging circumstances. So, as you leave the workshops behind and step back into the bustling streets of Venice, take a moment to reflect on the artisans who helped shape this city. They were the unsung heroes of their time, their stories etched into every piece of glass, every thread of silk. Venice, with its romantic allure and gritty reality, is a city built on the dreams and determination of those who refused to let their craft be bound by the constraints of their world. And with that, your day in medieval Venice comes to an end. You've navigated its markets, braved its canals, dined at its tables, and uncovered the stories behind its storied past. As the sun sets over the lagoon, casting a golden glow over the city, remember that Venice is more than just a place. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of innovation, resilience, and the human capacity to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. So, until next time, keep your wits sharp and your curiosity sharper. Venice, in all its chaotic, captivating glory, will be waiting. In the grand tapestry of ancient history, the Phoenicians were like the hidden thread that held the whole thing together, yet somehow always managed to avoid taking center stage. If history were a high school drama, they'd be that quiet kid in the back who ends up running a multi-billion-dollar tech company. We're talking about a people whose ships were the envy of the ancient world, navigating the seas with the same ease that you navigate Netflix on a lazy Saturday. But who were these Phoenicians, really? Spoiler alert. They were the original business moguls of the Mediterranean. Now, here's the deal with the Phoenicians. These folks hailed from what we now call Lebanon, a thin strip of land that was pretty much the Beverly Hills of ancient Port Real estate. The cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were their powerhouses, bustling like Times Square, but with fewer billboards and more cedar trees. And cedar trees, believe it or not, were their first claim to fame. They chopped down these giants and turned them into some of the best ships the ancient world had ever seen. Picture this. Massive, sleek ships cutting through the waves like a hot knife through hummus. The sea was their playground, and they weren't about to let a little thing like geography limit their aspirations. Phoenician ships sailed as far west as Spain and possibly even beyond. It's like they woke up one morning and thought, why stop at the Mediterranean when we've got the whole Atlantic Ocean to explore? Their trade routes were the ancient world's version of the internet, a sprawling web of connections linking places like Egypt, Greece, and North Africa. And just like your favorite social media platform, the Phoenician trade network was all about sharing. Only they shared goods like glass, purple dye, and a surprising amount of fish sauce. Speaking of purple dye, let's talk Tyrian purple, an exclusive color that made Roman emperors swoon and their treasuries groan. This wasn't just any dye. It was extracted from the murex snail, and it took about 10,000 of these little critters to produce a single gram of the stuff. Wrap your toga in Tyrian purple, and you were basically the ancient equivalent of Gucci. The Phoenicians cornered the market on this luxurious shade, proving that snails, while slow, could indeed fuel an economy. Now, while the idea of the Phoenicians as romantic seafaring adventurers is appealing, the truth is a bit more gritty. Their voyages weren't all sunsets and smooth sailing. Navigating the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean was no joke. Think of it as the ancient version of trying to fly budget airlines during a storm. Yet they braved pirates, storms, and the occasional hostile neighbor, all in pursuit of that sweet, sweet trade. But did you know these savvy seafarers might have also invented the original buy now, pay later scheme? Okay, maybe not in the way we know it today, but the Phoenicians were masters of credit and finance. They had systems in place that allowed traders to finance shipments, pay debts, and keep the goods flowing even when the cash wasn't. It's as if they anticipated the financial wizards of Wall Street by a couple of millennia. Let's not forget the sheer political finesse these folks had. Phoenician cities were politically independent, each ruled by its own king, yet they cooperated as if they shared a group chat. This loose federation allowed them to adapt and survive in a world dominated by larger empires. They were like cats, independent, a bit elusive, yet somehow always landing on their feet. Of course, the Phoenicians weren't perfect. They were involved in some less than savory practices, including slavery and ruthless competition. But hey, when you're dealing with ancient history, it's a package deal. Their legacy is a complex tapestry of innovation, commerce, and cultural exchange, with a few darker threads woven in for good measure. In short, the Phoenicians were the masters of maritime trade long before it was cool. They built an empire not with armies, but with ships and savvy, laying the groundwork for the interconnected world we know today. And while they may not have left behind grand monuments or epic tales, their influence is etched into the very fabric of history. So next time you see a big container ship cruising the ocean, give a nod to the Phoenicians, pioneers of the high seas and the original architects of globalization. And speaking of nods, let's tip our hats to the Phoenicians' knack for turning a snail and a tree into a thriving business model. Now, we all know about Tyrian purple, the color so exclusive it made the average Roman senator's toga look like fast fashion by comparison. But let's dig into the economics here. Tyrian purple wasn't just a statement, it was a symbol of power and wealth, a color that shouted, "I'm important, and I have the bank account to prove it." In today's terms, wearing Tyrian purple was like driving a vintage car with a custom license plate that reads money. But how did this all come about? Well, the Phoenicians weren't just tossing snails into a pot and hoping for the best. This was a meticulous process, requiring thousands of murex snails to produce just a single gram of dye. Talk about tedious. Imagine the patience, labor, and sheer perseverance required to gather these sea snails from the rocky shores, crack them open like a fortune cookie, and then extract their precious secretion. This wasn't just a trade, it was an art form. And once the dye was produced, it was shipped off to the highest bidders, who were more than willing to part with gold coins to drape themselves in the hue of emperors. Now, let's not forget the other big player in the Phoenician trade game, cedarwood. If Tyrian purple was the haute couture of dyes, cedar was the steel of its time, the backbone of construction for kings and pharaohs alike. The forests of ancient Lebanon were dense with these towering trees, their fragrance as intoxicating as their durability was legendary. No wonder the Egyptians, with their penchant for grand architecture, were eager customers. Cedar was the ancient world's must-have structural component, the golden material for building palaces, temples, and let's be honest, any grandiose project that screamed, "Look at me, I'm immortal." But how did the Phoenicians get all this stuff to market? Let's talk logistics. Because if the ancient world had a FedEx, it would have been run by the Phoenicians. These folks were masters of the seas, navigating the treacherous Mediterranean with a skill that made them the envy of the ancient world. Forget GPS. The Phoenicians relied on the stars, the currents, and a healthy dose of seafaring know-how passed down through generations. Their ships, crafted from that famed cedar, were the Formula One cars of the sea, sleek and resilient, capable of withstanding both storms and pirates. Sailing wasn't just about pointing your bow toward the nearest horizon and hoping for the best. The Phoenicians had to contend with everything from political alliances to trade embargoes, all while managing the equivalent of ancient shipping lanes. They knew the Mediterranean like the back of their calloused hands, from the bustling ports of Carthage to to the fertile fields of Sicily. They were the original navigators, charting courses that would make even the most seasoned sailors head spin. But let's not romanticize too much. The Mediterranean was a volatile place, and not every voyage ended with a profitable haul. There were storms that could capsize even the sturdiest vessel and pirates lurking in wait, ready to relieve a ship of its cargo. The Phoenicians faced these dangers with a mix of bravado and pragmatism, knowing that every successful trip meant not just profit, but survival in a competitive world where fortunes could turn as quickly as the tide. And while we're on the topic of survival, let's talk economics. The Phoenicians weren't just traders, they were savvy financiers. They understood the importance of credit and investment long before modern finance was a gleam in Wall Street's eye. They established systems that allowed for the extension of credit across vast distances, ensuring that goods kept flowing even when the coffers were temporarily dry. This wasn't just barter and trade. It was a sophisticated economy that laid the groundwork for future commercial empires. In the end, the Phoenicians were more than just traders. They were the architects of a network that connected disparate cultures, sharing not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and traditions. Their legacy isn't just in the artifacts they've left behind, but in the very fabric of global commerce and cultural exchange. As we continue to explore their impact, remember that every time you see a ship on the horizon or a brightly colored garment, you're witnessing a legacy that began with the Phoenicians, a people who turned the sea into their empire and left an indelible mark on history. As we pry open the treasure chest of Phoenician history, let's toss aside the romantic notion of them as gentle seafarers exchanging gifts with wide-eyed innocence. The truth, they were more like the Fortune 500 of the ancient world, complete with hostile takeovers and a dubious HR department. To understand their success, we need to delve into the political and social gears that kept this maritime machine running smoothly, or at least as smoothly as possible when you're dealing with ancient bureaucracy, fickle alliances, and the occasional bout of piracy. Let's start with their diplomatic prowess, which rivals even the most seasoned political operatives today. The Phoenicians were like the Switzerland of the Mediterranean, neutral, shrewd, and always ready to make a deal. They mastered the art of playing nice with the big kids on the block, whether that meant cozying up to the Egyptians or shaking hands with the Assyrians. Their cities, particularly Tyre and Sidon, were like those savvy politicians who managed to keep everyone happy while quietly advancing their own interests. A Phoenician leader at the negotiation table was akin to a chess grandmaster plotting several moves ahead, ensuring that their cities remained safe and, more importantly, prosperous. But as much as they were diplomats, the Phoenicians weren't above a little bit of old-school piracy. Why pay for goods when you can simply take them? The Mediterranean was a free-for-all, and the Phoenicians knew how to exploit the chaos to their advantage. They were the original pirates of the Mediterranean, long before Johnny Depp donned eyeliner, swooping in on rival ships and relieving them of their cargo. This wasn't just opportunism, it was a calculated strategy to maintain dominance. After all, a few lost shipments here and there could cripple a competitor's economy while boosting their own. Now, let's tackle one of the biggest myths about the Phoenicians, the idea that they were some sort of ancient democratic utopia. Spoiler alert, they weren't. While it's tempting to picture them as egalitarian pioneers, their society was more akin to an elite club with a very selective guest list. The cities were run by merchant oligarchies. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a board of directors, each member wielding significant influence over trade, politics, and social norms. These weren't elected officials. They were the wealthiest and most powerful merchants, the ones who had the means to dictate policy and shape the future. Imagine a society where the 1% not only controlled the wealth, but also wrote the rules for everyone else to follow. This merchant-driven governance wasn't just about hoarding wealth. It was about ensuring the longevity of their trade networks and the prosperity of their cities. The oligarchs understood that stability was key to maintaining their economic empire, so they invested in infrastructure, like ports and warehouses, and established trade agreements that ensured the steady flow of goods. But let's not kid ourselves. They also had a vested interest in keeping their coffers full and their status unchallenged. Now, how did this oligarchic structure impact the average Phoenician? Well, if you weren't part of the merchant elite, life could be tough. Sure, there were opportunities for social mobility. but they often came at a steep price. The average citizen was expected to support the oligarch's trade endeavors, whether that meant laboring in the shipyards, manning the oars, or even risking life and limb on a trade expedition. It was a society built on commerce, and everyone had a role to play, whether they liked it or not. Despite the rigid social hierarchy, the Phoenicians were remarkably adaptable. They had to be, given the ever-shifting political landscape of the ancient world. Their cities were like chameleons, able to change allegiances and strategies as needed to survive. This adaptability was crucial, especially when larger empires came knocking. By aligning themselves with powerful neighbors, the Phoenicians ensured their survival and continued prosperity, even as the world around them changed. In terms of economic strategy, the Phoenicians were ahead of their time. They understood the value of diversification, ensuring that their trade networks included a wide range of goods and services. From luxury items like Tyrian purple and cedarwood to everyday necessities like grain and olive oil, the Phoenicians had their fingers in every economic pie. This diversified portfolio not only protected them from market fluctuations, but also allowed them to capitalize on new opportunities whenever they arose. But let's not forget the darker side of their economic success. The Phoenicians weren't just traders, they were also slave owners. The demand for labor to fuel their expansive trade networks meant that slavery was an integral part of their economy. Captured during raids or bought from other traders, slaves were a valuable commodity, used to man the ships, work the fields, and build the cities that made Phoenician success possible. It's a grim reminder that prosperity often comes at a cost, and the Phoenicians were no exception to this harsh reality. As we continue to explore the intricacies of Phoenician society, it's important to remember that their legacy is a double-edged sword. They were innovators, pioneers, and savvy businessmen, but they were also products of their time, navigating a world where might often made right. Their story is one of contrasts, of wealth and poverty, of diplomacy and piracy, of innovation and exploitation. And while it's tempting to romanticize their achievements, we must also acknowledge the complexities and contradictions that define their existence. So as we sail further into the depths of Phoenician history, let's keep our eyes open to the realities that shaped their world. The Phoenicians were more than just traders. They were architects of a society that balanced on the edge of a knife, forever navigating the turbulent waters of commerce, politics, and survival. And while they may not have left behind grand monuments or epic tales, their influence is etched into the very fabric of history, a legacy as enduring as the waves they once sailed. Now, if you thought the Phoenicians were just the ancient world's version of savvy Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, let's dive into some of the less glamorous parts of their business model. We've already touched on their flair for commerce and navigation, but here's where we start peeling back the layers. Like an onion, only this one's about to make you cry for different reasons. Their success wasn't just built on cedarwood and snail dye. It was also reinforced by some grim practices that would make even the most hardened venture capitalist blush. First up on the docket of uncomfortable truths is the role of slavery in Phoenician society, a subject that's as pleasant as a Monday morning meeting with your boss. Slavery was not a side hustle. It was a cornerstone of their bustling economy. The Phoenicians were adept at acquiring slaves through trade, battles, and those charming pirate raids we love to romanticize. It's estimated that slaves made up a significant portion of the population in their key cities, with some historians suggesting figures as high as 10–15%, not exactly a footnote in their societal structure. The demand for labor was high, particularly when you consider the logistics of maintaining vast trade networks and constructing ships that were essentially the luxury yachts of the ancient world. Slaves were the workforce behind the curtain, the invisible gears turning the wheels of Phoenician commerce. They manned the oars on those famous ships, worked the fields, and even toiled in the production of that illustrious Tyrian purple. This wasn't just a matter of economic efficiency. It was a brutal necessity in an era where human rights were as foreign as Wi-Fi. But wait, it gets darker. The Phoenicians, like many ancient cultures, also have a cloud of controversy hanging over them that makes your average corporate scandal look like a playground squabble. I'm talking about the notorious claims of human sacrifice, a topic that's been debated more than the best pizza topping. According to some ancient sources, like the Evercherry and sometimes unreliable Diodorus Siculus, the Phoenicians practiced child sacrifice, particularly in times of dire need or disaster. The Carthaginians, the most famous colony, even built huge tarfets, sacrificial grounds, that lend some credence to these chilling tales. Now, let's not jump to conclusions faster than a caffeine-fueled rabbit. The evidence is patchy and often sensationalized by their enemies, who were about as unbiased as a sports fan in the playoffs. However, archaeological finds, including urns containing the remains of young children, suggest that at least some form of ritual sacrifice was practiced. It's a grim reminder that the past wasn't all entrepreneurial spirit and maritime adventures. There was a darkness that underscored the light. So why would a society so advanced in commerce turn to such extreme measures? The answer lies in the complex tapestry of belief and survival. The Phoenicians were deeply religious, with a pantheon that demanded respect and reverence. In their worldview, sacrifice, particularly of something as precious as a child, was the ultimate offering to appease the gods, a desperate plea for favor or intervention. It's a stark illustration of how ancient societies often intertwined faith with fear, using religion as both a guiding light and a source of terror. But before you start picturing the Phoenicians as ancient villains twirling their mustaches, remember that this was a time when life was precarious, and the divine was perceived as a capricious force that could make or break a civilization. They were people trying to make sense of a world that was as unpredictable as a stock market crash, and sometimes their methods were as crude as their tools. The allure of the Phoenicians is, in part, the sheer dichotomy of their existence, pioneers of trade and finance, yet bound to the brutal norms of their era. They were a society that could create breathtaking art and architecture and still hold onto practices that seem barbaric to modern sensibilities. It's this contrast that makes them so endlessly fascinating, a civilization straddling the line between innovation and tradition, progress and peril. In dissecting their legacy, we're left with more questions than answers, a narrative as complex and entangled as the sea routes they once mastered. How much of their story is myth? How much is reality? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from a society that thrived amid such contradictions? The Phoenicians challenge us to look beyond the romantic veneer and grapple with the messy, often uncomfortable truths of history. As we sail closer to the conclusion of this journey, keep in mind that history is rarely black and white. It's a swirling sea of grey waves, and the Phoenicians navigated it with both brilliance and brutality. Their story is a reminder that the past is never as simple as it seems, a tapestry woven with both the finest silk and the coarsest thread. So as we continue to unravel the mysteries of their world, remember that the truth is often found in the spaces between the legend and the reality. Stay tuned, because the final leg of our voyage promises even more revelations. We're not done charting these murky waters just yet. So, as we sail closer to the conclusion of this journey, keep in mind that history is rarely black and white. It's a swirling sea of grey waves, and the Phoenicians navigated it with both brilliance and brutality. Their story is a reminder that the past is never as simple as it seems, a tapestry woven with both the finest silk and the coarsest thread. So as we continue to unravel the mysteries of their world, remember that the truth is often found in the spaces between the legend and the reality. Now, let's get to the part where we toast to the Phoenicians' enduring legacy and then watch the inevitable decline of their maritime empire. Hold on to your togas, because this is where our story takes a turn toward the grand finale. First, let's give a nod to their most lasting contribution to Western civilization, the alphabet, before you roll your eyes and say, yeah, we know all about A, B, and C. Let's appreciate just how revolutionary this was. The Phoenicians took the cumbersome and exclusive cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems and gave them a makeover akin to transforming a horse-drawn cart into a Lamborghini. They stripped it down to 22 characters, each representing a consonant, which made writing accessible to more than just the elite scribes. Think of it as the democratization of literacy. It's like when smartphones replaced rotary phones, making communication a breeze instead of a chore. This alphabet wasn't just a local phenomenon either. It spread like wildfire, reaching the Greeks, who then added vowels because, let's face it, trying to read without them is like trying to navigate a dark room without a flashlight. This evolution eventually morphed into the Latin alphabet, which, spoiler alert, you're reading right now. So next time you jot down a grocery list or scribble a passive-aggressive note to your neighbor, remember to thank the Phoenicians for making that possible. But while their alphabet was busy revolutionizing communication, their empire was facing the kind of challenges that even the best PR team couldn't spin. The decline of Phoenician power was a slow burn rather than a dramatic crash, more akin to a fading rock star than a sudden fall from grace. Their trade networks, once the envy of the Mediterranean, began to unravel as new powers rose and old allies turned into competitors. Carthage, their most famous offspring, was busy doing what rebellious teenagers do best, trying to outshine their parents. While the city-state initially thrived under Phoenician influence, it eventually grew into a powerhouse in its own right, famously locking horns with Rome in the Punic Wars. Spoiler alert, Rome won, but not before Carthage gave them a serious run for their money. Meanwhile, back in the homeland, the Phoenician cities were dealing with the kind of economic pressures that make modern recessions look like a Sunday picnic. The Assyrians, Babylonians, and later the Persians all took turns knocking on Phoenicia's door, demanding tribute and reminding them that independence was more a nostalgic dream than a reality. Picture this: a series of increasingly demanding landlords, each one squeezing their tenants a little harder until the rent becomes impossible to pay. It wasn't long before the Phoenicians found themselves under the thumb of these larger empires, trading autonomy for survival. By the time Alexander the Great came strutting onto the scene, the Phoenicians were more like a shadow of their former selves. Alexander, never one to shy away from a challenge, besieged the city of Tyre in 332 BC in a conquest that was as much about strategic positioning as it was about making a statement. The siege lasted 7 months, a drawn-out affair that ended with Alexander's forces finally breaching the city walls. The message was clear. The age of the independent Phoenician city-states was over. And yet, despite their decline, the Phoenicians left an indelible mark on the world. Their legacy is felt not just in the alphabet, but in the DNA of modern trade and commerce. They were pioneers of globalization, building a network that connected diverse cultures long before the term became a buzzword in business schools. Their influence can be seen in the spread of goods, ideas, and even people across the ancient world, a testament to their ingenuity and ambition. It's also worth noting how their story echoes in the modern age. Today's maritime trade routes owe a silent debt to the paths carved out by Phoenician sailors. When you see a container ship gliding across the ocean, think of those ancient vessels, teeming with goods and brimming with the promise of profit. The credit systems they developed were the forerunners of modern finance, showing us that the concept of buy now, pay later is as old as civilization itself. But let's not forget the cautionary tales embedded in their history. The Phoenicians remind us that even the mightiest can fall prey to the relentless march of time and change. Their decline serves as a sobering lesson in the fragility of power and the ever-shifting sands of political alliances. Empires rise and fall, but the lessons they leave behind endure, offering us insights into human nature and the timeless dance of ambition and adversity. So as we wrap up this odyssey through Phoenician history, let's take a moment to appreciate the nuances of their story. They were more than just ancient traders. They were visionaries who bridged worlds and shaped the course of history. Their tale is a tapestry of triumphs and trials, a testament to the enduring human spirit and our unyielding quest for connection and commerce. In the end, the Phoenicians were a reminder that history is less about dusty scrolls and more about understanding how we got here. It's about recognizing the threads that link us to the past and weaving them into the fabric of our present. So here's to the Phoenicians, the original architects of globalization, whose legacy continues to ripple through time, one sail, one trade, and one letter at a time. And with that, we drop anchor on this chapter of history, leaving you with a treasure trove of knowledge and a newfound appreciation for the ancient world's unsung heroes. The Roman military wasn't always the mighty juggernaut of empire-crushing fame. In its earliest days, it was more like a scrappy street corner gang trying to organize itself into something resembling a coherent force. Think less gladiator, and more like a group of over-enthusiastic amateurs trying to find their place in the chaos of ancient warfare. During the time of the Roman kingdom, which kicked off around 753 BCE, Rome was just a small city-state in central Italy. It was a fledgling power, striving to survive in a neighborhood full of more established bullies like the Etruscans and the Samnites. The military during this era was far from the professional army that would later conquer half the known world. The idea of the citizen soldier was more than just a myth. It was a necessity. Every Roman male between the ages of 17 and 46 was expected to serve as a soldier if the city called upon them. These men would leave their farms, workshops, or whatever modest business they were running to grab a spear and shield and head to the battlefield. It was less about national service and more about survival. Rome needed every able-bodied man to stave off threats from all directions. The expectation was simple: fight, win, and get back to the farm in time for harvest. However, the romantic image of the farmer dropping his plow to heroically defend his land belies the gritty realities of the time. The early Roman military was a patchwork quilt of hand-me-down weapons and mismatched armor. The government, such as it was, wasn't exactly rolling in cash, so soldiers were often expected to provide their own equipment. It was a system that would make modern accountants break into a cold sweat. This DIY approach to military outfitting meant that the wealthier soldiers could afford better gear, creating a kind of ancient arms race. Meanwhile, poorer soldiers might end up wielding little more than a pointy stick and a lot of enthusiasm. Roman military organization during the kingdom period was rudimentary at best. Command structures were as flexible as a wet noodle, with local leaders cobbling together strategies on the fly. The army was divided into units called century, ostensibly made up of 100 men, although in practice, numbers could vary wildly based on who showed up that day. The centurions, or leaders of these groups, were often chosen for their political connections rather than their military acumen. It's like choosing your starting quarterback based on how well they can schmooze the coach. As Rome transitioned into a republic around 509 BCE, the military began to evolve alongside the political structure. This period saw the introduction of the legion, a more organized and efficient military unit that would become the backbone of Roman military might. The early legions were made up of about 200 men, divided into 3 lines: the Hastati, the Principes, and the Triarii. The Hastati were the young guns, eager but green, and were often sent in first to absorb the brunt of the enemy's attack. Behind them stood the Principes, battle-hardened veterans who were supposed to stabilize the line if the Hastati faltered. And finally, the Triarii, seasoned warriors who were only called upon in desperate situations, stood ready as a last line of defense. The saying, "It's come to the Triarii," became a Roman idiom for when things got really dire. This tripartite formation was a significant leap forward in military tactics, offering flexibility and depth on the battlefield. It was the ancient equivalent of having a plan B, C, and D ready to go, just in case things went sideways, which they often did. However, while the organization improved, the financial backing didn't necessarily keep pace. Rome was still pinching denarii, trying to maintain its army on a shoestring budget. Soldiers were often compensated with land grants after their service, a sort of down payment on their loyalty. It was a system that worked as long as Rome had land to offer, but it wasn't exactly sustainable in the long run. During this period, the Roman military also began to adapt tactics and technologies from their neighbors and enemies. The Romans were nothing if not pragmatic, and they were more than willing to swipe a good idea when they saw one. They borrowed heavily from the Etruscans and the Greeks, incorporating elements like the phalanx formation, which was perfect for turning a disorganized rabble into a disciplined fighting unit. It was a process of military osmosis that allowed Rome to punch above its weight class, often surprising more established forces with their ingenuity and adaptability. But let's not romanticize these early days too much. The Roman military was also notorious for its brutal discipline. Flogging was a common punishment for insubordination or cowardice, and the dreaded practice of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 soldiers in a failing unit, was a harsh reminder of the consequences of failure. The Romans understood that fear could be just as effective a motivator as patriotism. It was a tough-love approach to soldiering that ensured everyone kept their eyes on the prize. Survival and victory, in that order. So there you have it. An army born out of necessity, nurtured on a diet of borrowed tactics and brutal discipline, all while keeping a tight grip on the purse strings. The early Roman military was a testament to the sheer will and resourcefulness of a people determined to carve out a place for themselves in a hostile world. It was a rough start, but the seeds of greatness were already being sown. The Republic was just getting warmed up, and the world had no idea what was about to hit it. The gears of Roman ambition were just starting to turn, and as the Republic found its footing, it set its sights beyond the Italian peninsula. Enter the Punic Wars, a trilogy of conflicts that would redefine Rome and its military for centuries. Think of it as Rome's coming-of-age saga, with Carthage playing the role of the formidable rival that refuses to back down. These wars were less about two kids squabbling over a sandbox, and more like two titans wrestling for domination of the Mediterranean, with the fate of empires hanging in the balance. The First Punic War kicked off in 264 BCE, and it was a classic tale of two superpowers grappling for control of Sicily, that sun-drenched island sitting pretty between Italy and North Africa. Rome, ever the landlubber at this point, found itself pitted against Carthage, whose naval prowess was the envy of the ancient world. Carthage's fleet was sleek, fast, and deadly, a maritime juggernaut that made the Roman navy look like a flotilla of Bath toys. The Romans, not ones to be daunted by a little thing like total naval inferiority, did what they did best. They borrowed and adapted. They captured a Carthaginian ship, reverse-engineered it, and churned out their own fleet like it was the ancient version of IKEA flat-pack furniture. But here's where the Roman genius really shone. They recognized that their strength lay in gritty hand-to-hand combat, not in the delicate art of naval warfare. So they invented the Corvus Asterisk, a boarding device that turned sea battles into land battles. Imagine a massive spiked plank that grappled enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to swarm aboard and do what they did best, fight like their lives depended on it. This audacious innovation helped Rome win a decisive victory at the Battle of Meiji in 260 BCE, proving that even on water, Rome could play to its strengths. Now, the First Punic War didn't wrap up quickly. It dragged on for 23 years, a marathon of attrition that bled both sides dry. Rome eventually emerged victorious in 241 BCE, but at a staggering cost. The war had drained the Roman treasury, and it wasn't like they could whip out a credit card to cover the shortfall. Instead, they turned to the ancient equivalent of a bake sale, taxing the citizens and seizing land to sell off to pay debts. The financial strain was immense, and it sowed the seeds of social unrest that would simmer for years. The Second Punic War, however, was where things really got spicy. It kicked off in 218 BCE with a certain Carthaginian commander named Hannibal who decided to crash Rome's party in the most dramatic way possible. Forget the typical sea invasion. Hannibal opted for a surprise overland assault. He marched an army, complete with war elephants over the Alps. Yes, you heard that right. Elephants in the snow. It was like the ancient version of a blockbuster road trip movie, complete with perilous mountain crossings and unexpected ambushes. Hannibal's daring trek and subsequent victories, like the legendary Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where he encircled and annihilated a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own, left Rome reeling. Cannae was a masterclass in tactics, a symphony of strategy that would be studied for millennia. Hannibal's forces killed or captured as many as 50, 000 to 70, 000 Roman soldiers in a single day. For Rome, it was a disaster of epic proportions, like watching their favorite gladiator get pummeled in the arena. But here's the thing about Rome. They had a tenacity that bordered on the obsessive. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, they dug in their heels and adapted. Roman commanders, like Quintus Fabius Maximus, embraced a strategy of attrition, wearing down Hannibal's forces with guerrilla tactics and avoiding large-scale confrontations. This Fabian strategy wasn't glamorous, but it was effective, proving that sometimes patience can be as potent as aggression. Meanwhile, the economic and social costs of the war mounted. The Roman countryside was ravaged. Farms lay in ruins, and the relentless demand for soldiers took a toll on the population. Families were torn apart, and the specter of poverty loomed over the Republic. The Senate, ever pragmatic, knew that to win the war, they needed resources, manpower, and, critically, allies. Rome began forging alliances across the Mediterranean, leveraging diplomacy to bolster their ranks and resources. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Rome finally dealt Hannibal a crushing defeat, thanks in no small part to the tactical brilliance of Scipio Africanus and the support of Numidian cavalry. Hannibal's elephants were rendered ineffective, and his troops found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Carthage was forced to sue for peace, marking the end of the Second Punic War and cementing Rome's dominance in the western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War, though more of a mop-up operation than a full-blown conflict, was Rome's final act of vengeance against Carthage. It was a 3-year siege that culminated in 146 BCE with the complete destruction of Carthage. The city was razed to the ground, its population sold into slavery, and the land reportedly salted to prevent future habitation, a brutal exclamation point to Rome's victory. Yet, the Punic Wars were more than just a tale of military triumph. They reshaped the Roman military and society in profound ways. Rome's army evolved from a citizen militia into a more professional force, capable of projecting power across distant lands. The legions became the hammer of the Republic, and the world was their anvil. But the wars also highlighted the harsh realities of empire building, the staggering human cost, the financial strain, and the moral ambiguities of conquest. Financially, the wars had drained Rome's coffers, but they also opened new avenues of wealth. Conquered territories brought spoils and slaves, fueling Rome's economy and its ambitions. However, wealth and power also sowed seeds of corruption and inequality as the rich grew richer and the poor bore the brunt of war's demands. The social fabric of Rome was stretched thin, and the strain would only grow in the years to come. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, but victory came at a price, and the Republic was left grappling with the consequences of its newfound power. The stage was set for further expansion, but also for internal strife that would test the resilience of the Roman state. The Punic Wars were over, but the echoes of their impact would reverberate through Roman history like a drumbeat, driving the Republic towards its destiny as a global empire. And so, as Rome looked to the horizon, the challenges of empire loomed large. The Republic had weathered the storm, but the lessons of war, adaptation, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of power would continue to shape its path. The story of Rome was far from over, and the saga of its military, its society, and its politics would unfold in new and unexpected ways. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises to be just as thrilling. The dust from the Punic Wars had barely settled when Rome, now the big kid on the Mediterranean block, found itself staring at a new challenge, maintaining control over its sprawling territories. The Republic was like a teenager who suddenly inherited a mansion. It had all this space, but no clue how to manage it. Enter Julius Caesar, a charismatic general with a penchant for power that would make even the most ambitious politician blush. Caesar's rise marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic, setting the stage for a dramatic transformation into a mighty empire. Caesar's story is a classic tale of ambition, military genius, and a bit of hubris thrown in for good measure. He was the rock star of Roman generals, commanding legions with the kind of flair that made him a household name. His conquest of Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE was nothing short of spectacular, adding a vast territory to Roman control and filling the coffers with plunder. But let's not sugarcoat it. Caesar's campaigns were brutal. His army, numbering about 50,000 men, carved a path through Gaul, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. By the time he was done, over 1 million Gauls were dead or enslaved. Not exactly the stuff of bedtime stories, but it was this ruthless efficiency that secured his power. Caesar's military success gave him unprecedented popularity, but it also made him a threat to the Senate. Rome's political elite, jittery and suspicious, demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar, never one to follow orders, famously crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE with his legion, a bold move that signaled outright defiance. It was the ancient equivalent of tossing a match into a powder keg, igniting a civil war between Caesar's forces and those loyal to the Senate. Spoiler alert, Caesar won. After emerging victorious in 45 BCE, Caesar was appointed dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life. But his reign was a short-lived affair. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, a group of senators, fearing his growing power, assassinated him in a cloak-and-dagger plot that would make any political thriller seem tame. The assassination plunged Rome into chaos, proving that while the sword could conquer lands, politics had its own deadly arsenal. This chaos set the stage for the rise of Augustus, the man who would take Caesar's vision and turn it into an imperial reality. Augustus, formerly known as Octavian, was Caesar's adopted heir and a shrewd political operator. He played the long game, slowly gathering power and consolidating his control. By 27 BCE, he had established himself as the first Roman emperor, marking the official transition from republic to empire. Augustus was the architect of a new political order, one that would endure for centuries. Now, let's talk military reform. Augustus knew that if Rome was going to sustain its empire, it needed a professional army, not just a band of part-time warriors. So, he set about transforming the legions into a standing force. Under his reforms, the Roman army became a career for life. Soldiers enlisted for a standard term of 25 years, which was a pretty hefty commitment considering the average life expectancy was around 35. In return, they received regular pay, land pensions, and citizenship, creating a loyal and disciplined force. The size of the army under Augustus swelled to around 28 legions, totaling approximately 150,000 soldiers. And let's not forget the auxiliary forces, composed of non-citizens, which added another 150,000. This was no ragtag militia. It was a well-oiled military machine capable of projecting power across 3 continents. But here's the kicker. Feeding and equipping an army of this size was a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to organize a Thanksgiving dinner for thousands, every day, across multiple time zones. The cost of maintaining this military juggernaut was astronomical. Augustus implemented a series of financial reforms to fund the army, including the creation of the aerarium militare, a military treasury funded by new taxes. This was the ancient version of a defense budget, and it was no small feat. Augustus had to ensure the coffers were replenished regularly, juggling taxes and revenues like a seasoned accountant with a penchant for empire building. Yet, Augustus' reforms weren't just about logistics. They were a masterstroke of political strategy. By professionalizing the army, he effectively removed the military's dependence on individual commanders, making it loyal to the state, and by extension, to Augustus himself. This shift in loyalty was crucial for maintaining stability and preventing ambitious generals from pulling a Caesar. Augustus had learned from history, and he wasn't about to let the sword dictate the empire's fate again. But let's not forget the social implications of this military makeover. The Roman soldier became a symbol of imperial power, a living embodiment of Rome's might. Veterans were settled in colonies across the empire, spreading Roman culture and influence far and wide. These colonies acted as strategic outposts, ensuring that Roman law and order reached even the most distant provinces. It was a clever way to Romanize the world, one settlement at a time. However, the peace and stability of Augustus' reign, often dubbed the Pax Romana, came with its own set of challenges. The Roman Empire was a tapestry of diverse cultures and languages, and managing this multicultural mosaic required a delicate balance of diplomacy and force. Augustus was a master of this balancing act, skillfully navigating the political landscape to maintain harmony. Economically, the empire was a powerhouse, driven by a complex web of trade routes that stretched from Britain to Egypt. Roman coins, stamped with the emperor's image, circulated widely, symbolizing unity and economic stability. However, the reliance on slave labor remained a dark stain on this prosperity. Slavery was the engine of the economy, providing cheap labor for agriculture, mining, and construction. It was a system that benefited the elite, widening the gap between the rich and the poor. As Augustus' reign drew to a close, the empire he had built was a testament to his vision and cunning, but it was also a reminder of the fragile balance of power. The Roman military, now a professional force, was both a tool of conquest and a guardian of peace. It was a double-edged sword, one that could protect the empire or, if wielded unwisely, bring it to its knees. So, as Augustus took his final bow in AD 14, he left behind a legacy that would shape the course of history. The Roman Empire, with its professional military, economic might, and cultural influence, stood as a beacon of power and ambition. But beneath the surface, the seeds of its future challenges were already sown. The story of Rome was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be just as complex and captivating. Stay tuned, because this roller coaster of history is only picking up speed. The Roman Empire was standing tall, basking in the glow of its Pax Romana, but don't let the serene facade fool you. Behind the imperial curtain lay a labyrinth of challenges that would make even the most seasoned strategist break into a cold sweat. Imagine juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle, and you've got a taste of what it was like to manage Rome's sprawling borders. At its zenith, the Roman Empire stretched over 5 million square kilometers, covering a diverse patchwork quilt of cultures, landscapes, and yes, potential insurgencies. From the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, each corner of the empire had its own unique set of headaches. Defending these vast borders was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. You had the Rhine and the Danube acting as natural barriers in Europe, but there were plenty of places where a determined enemy could slip through the cracks. The Roman military was a marvel of organization and efficiency, but even their mighty legions weren't immune to the logistical nightmare of defending such a far-flung empire. They were like a world-class orchestra trying to perform in a stadium with a bad sound system. Roman soldiers were stationed in forts and watchtowers along the frontiers, living lives that were less about glorious battles and more about dealing with the daily grind of military monotony. Picture a Roman soldier on the freezing banks of the Rhine, more concerned about keeping his toes from freezing off than the glory of Rome. But don't get too caught up in the romance of the Roman legionary standing resolute on the frontier. These soldiers faced harsh realities that would make anyone question their career choices. The pay. A soldier's annual salary was about 225 denarii, which sounds decent until you realize the cost of living in the Roman Empire was no joke. Plus, the idea of a steady paycheck was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Delays were common, and soldiers often had to make do until the treasury decided to cough up the cash. Then there was the engineering prowess of the Roman military. Those infamous Roman roads didn't build themselves, you know. Engineering was the unsung hero of Roman warfare, allowing the army to move quickly and efficiently across the empire. These roads were the ancient equivalent of a military superhighway, enabling the rapid deployment of troops and ensuring supply lines were as smooth as a marble statue. The engineering department of the Roman military was like the nerdy kid in high school who quietly aced all his tests and ended up running the world. And let's not forget the walls. No, not the metaphorical ones politicians love to talk about. These were actual walls, like Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Stretching over 117 kilometers, this stone barrier was built to keep out the pesky Picts and served as a testament to Roman engineering expertise. But here's the kicker. The wall was more a show of strength than an impenetrable fortress. It was a statement, a reminder to any would-be invaders that the Romans were not messing around. Yet, maintaining such fortifications required constant manpower and resources, both of which were often in short supply. Of course, while the soldiers were busy keeping the barbarians at bay, back in Rome, corruption was brewing like a bad cup of wine. The Roman Empire, as mighty as it was, couldn't escape the age-old human penchant for greed and power. Corruption in the ranks was like a leaky bucket. No matter how much water you pour in, it never quite fills up. Officers would skim off the top of military budgets, supplies would mysteriously disappear, and political patronage often determined promotions more than merit. One infamous case was the scandal involving Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a Roman statesman who wielded power like a kid who just discovered a stash of fireworks. Sejanus was the head of the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit tasked with protecting the emperor. But instead of sticking to his job description, he played a game of political chess, eliminating rivals and amassing power. His downfall was as spectacular as his rise, a testament to the volatile nature of Roman politics. Now, let's talk campaigns. The Dacian Wars under Emperor Trajan are a prime example of Roman military might in action. Trajan, like a Roman version of Alexander the Great with a better toga, led his legions into the rugged terrain of modern-day Romania. The Dacians, led by their king Decebalus, were no pushovers, and the campaign was a brutal affair. Trajan's victories were immortalized on Trajan's Column, a towering monument that still stands in Rome today, depicting the triumphs and trials of the Roman legions. But while the Column tells a story of glory and conquest, the reality was far from glamorous. The campaign stretched Roman resources thin, with soldiers facing harsh conditions and formidable foes. The Dacian Wars were a stark reminder that even at the height of its power, the Roman military was constantly tested. The rewards, however, were worth the struggle. The conquest of Dacia brought vast new resources, including the gold mines of the Apuseni Mountains, a welcome boost to Rome's coffers. It was like hitting the jackpot in the ancient world, with the spoils of victory fueling further expansion and solidifying Rome's dominance. Despite these triumphs, the Roman Empire's Achilles' heel was its sheer size and the constant pressure to defend its borders. The legions were stretched thin, and the once unbreakable chain of command was beginning to show cracks. The empire's reliance on auxiliary forces, non-Roman citizens who served alongside the legions, was both a strength and a vulnerability. These troops provided much-needed manpower, but their loyalty was often more to their paymasters than to Rome itself. As if that wasn't enough, Rome also had to grapple with the economic burden of maintaining such a massive military presence. Feeding an army on the march was one thing. Sustaining a standing force spread across vast territories was another beast entirely. The logistical demands were staggering, with supply lines stretching across continents. Grain shipments from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, and wine from Gaul kept the legions fed and happy, but any disruption could spell disaster. And let's not sugarcoat the economic toll. The Roman economy was a complex beast, heavily reliant on agriculture, trade, and let's face it, the occasional bout of plunder. Inflation was a persistent issue, with currency debasement becoming a favorite trick of emperors trying to stretch their budgets. By the 3rd century, the denarius, the silver coin that had long been the backbone of Roman commerce, was little more than a glorified coin-shaped piece of metal. The social dynamics were just as tricky. The Roman Empire was a melting pot of cultures, and maintaining harmony required more than just military might. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, with Rome trying to balance the desires of its diverse subjects. Local elites were often co-opted into the Roman system, given a taste of power in exchange for their loyalty. It was a clever strategy, but one that required constant attention, lest any cracks widen into chasms. And so, as the Roman Empire basked in its imperial glory, the seeds of its challenges were already sown. The military was both a symbol of its power and a constant reminder of the empire's vulnerabilities. The dance of expansion and defense was a never-ending waltz, one that required constant vigilance and adaptation. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, was a complex web of ambition, resourcefulness, and the occasional touch of madness. As we look ahead, the story of Rome is far from over. The empire's legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy, a testament to the heights of human achievement and the depths of its folly. The next chapter promises to be as riveting as the last, with new challenges on the horizon and the enduring question of how an empire built on such a grand scale could endure the test of time. Stay tuned, because the saga of Rome is a tale for the ages, and the best is yet to come. As the Roman Empire strutted through history with all the bravado of a peacock on parade, the cracks beneath its grandiose facade began to widen. The legions, once the iron backbone of Rome's power, were slowly sagging under the weight of 1,000 burdens. Economic strain, political chaos, and the relentless pressure of barbarian invasions gnawed at the empire like termites in a wooden mansion. Picture an ancient superpower grappling with existential dread, and you'll get a sense of where we're headed. Let's start with the economy, or as it was known in Rome, the thing we hope doesn't collapse this week. Funding an empire the size of the Roman one was like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon, painfully slow and prone to spilling over. Inflation was rampant. By the 3rd century, the denarius was more of a shiny paperweight than a reliable currency. The empire had resorted to debasing currency so often that it was practically a hobby. Imagine your paycheck shrinking every year because the boss insists on paying you with monopoly money. That was the Roman economy in a nutshell. With the coffers scraping bottom, the Roman military found itself in a bind. The army that once inspired terror was now struggling to pay its soldiers. By 410 AD, when Alaric and his Visigoths were knocking on Rome's door, the legions were as cash-strapped as a college student at the end of the semester. Rome's solution: hire those very barbarians to guard the borders. It was a bit like hiring a fox to guard the henhouse, and shocker, it didn't end well. Meanwhile, the political scene in Rome was like a soap opera with swords. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed. Some were assassinated, others deposed, and a few just disappeared into the annals of history. At one point, during the aptly named crisis of the 3rd century, Rome saw 26 emperors in about 50 years. That's an average tenure of less than 2 years, like a revolving door of power-hungry maniacs who could barely keep their togas on straight. The political infighting was a spectacular mess, with generals playing emperor like a game of musical chairs, except the music never stopped, and the chairs were always on fire. The military, caught in the crossfire of this political melee, was stretched thin and demoralized. The legions that had once marched in perfect unison now resembled a ragtag band of mercenaries, more loyal to their commanding officers than to Rome itself. Loyalty became a commodity, and the highest bidder usually won. Trust was as rare as a snowball in the Sahara, and discipline was slipping faster than a chariot on an icy road. Externally, things weren't looking any rosier. The Roman Empire was like a juicy steak surrounded by starving wolves, and those wolves were getting bolder by the day. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, swept across Europe like a swarm of locusts, while the Goths, Vandals, and other so-called barbarians eyed Rome's wealth with envious eyes. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome. This was the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in over 800 years. Rome, the eternal city, had been humbled. The sack of Rome was a wake-up call, but Rome hit the snooze button and went back to dreaming of its former glory. Despite the shock, the empire limped on for a few more decades, a shadow of its former self. The Western Roman Empire finally met its end in 476 AD, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. It was less a dramatic fall and more a slow, inevitable decline, a whimper rather than a bang. So, what about the myth of Roman invincibility? It turns out that even the mightiest empires can crumble when their foundations are built on shifting sand. The romance of Roman power, with its legions and luster, was always at odds with the harsh reality of managing such a vast and diverse empire. Rome's story is a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing resources, of a political system that couldn't adapt to its own success. Yet, despite its fall, Rome's legacy echoes through history like a timeless ballad. The Roman military, for all its later failings, set the standard for discipline, organization, and innovation. Its roads, fortifications, and military tactics influenced generations of armies and empires. Roman law and governance, too, left an indelible mark, shaping the legal and political systems of countless nations. Historians and armchair strategists alike still debate the causes of Rome's decline, but one thing is clear. The empire's story is not just one of collapse, but of enduring influence. The lessons of Rome, about the balance of power, the limits of expansion, and the human thirst for control, remain as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. As we wrap up our journey through the annals of Roman military history, it's worth reflecting on the delicate dance between myth and reality. Rome, in all its grandeur and folly, reminds us that even the greatest empires are subject to the whims of fate and the frailties of human nature. So, the next time you hear someone waxing lyrical about the invincible Romans, remember, behind every legend lies a story far more complex, far more human, and far more fascinating than any myth could ever capture. In the smoky haze of 1852, Japan was a land of samurai swagger and shogunate shenanigans, a place where the old guard clung to power like a sumo wrestler on a slippery mat. Into this turbulent mix was born a boy named Matsuhito, who would later become Emperor Meiji. the man credited with dragging Japan kicking and screaming into the modern age. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. When Matsuhito popped into the world, the Tokugawa shogunate was still running the show, and the nation was as closed off as a hermit with trust issues. Now, the Tokugawa era was not exactly a hotbed of innovation. In fact, it was more like a comfortable old blanket that nobody wanted to throw out, even if it had a few holes in it. For over 250 years, the shogunate had maintained a policy of sakoku, or closed country, which meant that Japan was about as accessible to foreigners as a nightclub with an exclusive guest list. Only a handful of Dutch and Chinese traders were allowed to do business, and they were confined to the tiny island of Dejima in Nagasaki. But change was in the air, whether the shogunate liked it or not. Enter the scene. Young Matsuhito, a boy who had no idea he would one day preside over one of the most dramatic transformations in world history. He was born into a world of rigid etiquette and arcane rituals, where his every move was dictated by court protocol. Think of it as being raised in a historical reenactment society that took itself way too seriously. The irony here is delicious, isn't it? The future architect of Japan's modernization was being brought up in an environment that was about as modern as a horse-drawn carriage on a freeway. Matsuhito's early life was a blend of tradition and luxury, wrapped up in a cocoon of silk kimonos and the soothing sound of kodo music. His education was steeped in Confucian classics and traditional arts, ensuring he was well-versed in the ways of the past. But the winds of change have a way of sneaking in through the cracks, and the boy emperor found himself unexpectedly thrust into the limelight at the tender age of 14. Talk about being thrown in at the deep end. In 1867, the 15th and last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, decided to hand back power to the emperor, marking the end of the shogunate and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. Now, imagine being a teenager suddenly handed the keys to a kingdom. While most kids his age were worrying about pimples and crushes, Matsuhito had to figure out how to modernize an entire country. No pressure, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Despite being raised on a diet of tradition, Matsuhito was a curious lad, particularly when it came to the strange new world of Western technology. Japan, after all, had been playing peekaboo with the West for over 2 centuries, and the young emperor was keen to catch up on what he'd missed. While many of his contemporaries were wary of foreign influence, Matsuhito was intrigued by the gadgets and gizmos that were starting to make their way across the seas. There are accounts of him expressing fascination with everything from steam engines to telegraphs, which must have seemed like magic to a boy raised in a world where messengers on horseback were still a thing. And let's not forget those absurd moments that history loves to throw our way. Picture this: a young emperor, barely out of his teens, trying to wrap his head around a world that was rapidly changing before his eyes. The Meiji era was a time of contradictions, and Matsuhito found himself at the epicenter of it all. Japan was like a teenager going through an awkward growth spurt, trying to find its place in a world dominated by industrial powerhouses. Yet here was Matsuhito, with a keen eye for innovation and a willingness to embrace the new, even if it meant challenging centuries of tradition. Of course, romantic notions of the emperor as a progressive visionary must be taken with a pinch of salt. While Matsuhito was certainly an advocate for modernization, he was also a product of his time and circumstances. The Meiji Restoration was as much about survival as it was about transformation. Japan faced the threat of colonization by Western powers, and the only way to avoid being carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey was to adapt quickly. Matsuhito's reign was marked by a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the nation, including the abolition of the feudal system, the establishment of a constitutional government, and the modernization of the military. It was less about visionary leadership and more about pragmatic necessity. Yet, for all the upheaval, there was a certain humor to the way things unfolded. The old guard was forced to adapt or step aside, and the country embarked on a mad dash to catch up with the rest of the world. There were bound to be teething problems, and the Meiji era had its fair share of them. But through it all, Emperor Meiji remained a steady, if somewhat enigmatic, figure at the helm, guiding Japan through the choppy waters of change. In the end, Matsuhito's early years tell a story of irony and unexpected opportunity, of a boy raised in a world of strict tradition who would go on to become a symbol of modernity. His legacy is one of transformation and adaptation, a reminder that even the most rigid systems can be upended by the curious mind of a young boy with a penchant for innovation. And isn't that just the kind of historical plot twist that keeps us coming back for more? As the curtain rose on the Boshin War in 1868, Japan found itself in the throes of political drama that would have made any soap opera proud. On one side, the forces loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate were clinging to the past like a child with a favorite blanket. On the other, the imperial faction, driven by a vision of a modern, united Japan, was eager to ditch that blanket for something a bit more in vogue, like, say, a Western-style military uniform. At the heart of this tug-of-war was our young Emperor Meiji. But let's set the record straight. Meiji wasn't exactly the Napoleon of the East. His role was more akin to a mascot than a military strategist. While his name was emblazoned on banners and battle cries, the real heavy lifting was being done by a caste of ambitious samurai and political reformers who saw the emperor as their ticket to legitimacy. It's rather like a band using a famous guest star to sell tickets, while the roadies do the grunt work behind the scenes. In fact, Meiji's involvement in the Boshin War was limited to being the youthful face of a movement far bigger than himself. He was 15 when the war kicked off, and let's face it, most teenagers are still figuring out how to parallel park a horse, let alone steer a nation through civil conflict. Behind the scenes, figures like Seigo Takamori, often dubbed the Last Samurai, and Katsu Kaishu were the real power players, orchestrating battles and negotiating surrenders, while Meiji's main job was to look regal, a role he played admirably, if not actively. The Boshin War itself was a whirlwind affair, lasting a little over a year and covering ground from Kyoto to Hakodate. It was a mix of traditional samurai swordplay and the newfangled gunpowder warfare borrowed from the West. Picture this. Warriors charging into battle with swords gleaming under the sun, only to be met by a barrage of bullets from rifles that had just recently been the hot new thing in military circles. The irony isn't lost on us, or, presumably, on the samurai who suddenly found themselves on the wrong end of modernization. Meiji's contribution, while not on the battlefield, was symbolic. His presence unified the imperial forces, providing the moral high ground needed to rally troops and drum up support. It's a bit like being the face of a major brand. He didn't invent the product, but his image sold it. The victory of the imperial forces in 1869 marked not just the end of the shogunate, but the beginning of an era that would transform Japan from a feudal backwater to a global powerhouse. But let's talk about the hiccups along the way, because what's a revolution without a few stumbles? Enter the infamous Top-Knot Decree. In an effort to modernize, the government decided that samurai should ditch their traditional top-knots for Western-style haircuts. Now, if you think convincing a teenager to change their hairstyle is tough, try persuading a samurai to shear off a centuries-old symbol of status. The decree was as popular as a wet blanket at a picnic, leading to awkward encounters and a few barbers who probably wished they'd chosen a different career. Imagine the scene. Seasoned warriors with freshly coiffed hair, looking less like fearsome fighters and more like they'd just wandered out of a Parisian salon. The Top-Knot saga was just one of many awkward first steps Japan took toward modernization. Westernization was the buzzword of the day, and it touched everything from fashion to technology. For instance, Western clothing became a must-have for officials, leading to some amusing sartorial mishaps as traditional kimono wearers struggled to navigate the complexities of buttons and trousers. It was a time when clashing cultures met head-on, with Japan eager to learn from the West, but occasionally tripping over its own kimono hem in the process. Economically, the stakes were higher than a samurai's ponytail. The Meiji government understood that to stand toe-to-toe with the Western powers, Japan needed a serious upgrade in its infrastructure and industry. This meant pouring resources into building railways, telegraph lines, and factories, turning Japan into one giant construction site. The national budget was stretched thinner than a sumo wrestler in skinny jeans, but the investment paid off. Within a few decades, Japan went from having no railways to boasting over two, 000 kilometers of track. It was a transformation that would have made even the most seasoned urban planner sweat. Yet, for all the high-minded goals of the Meiji Restoration, it was the absurdities and idiosyncrasies of the era that often stole the show. There was something inherently comedic about a country racing to embrace modernity while still figuring out the finer points of Western etiquette, like the correct usage of a fork, a tool that perplexed many a Japanese diner accustomed to chopsticks. In the end, the Boshin War and the early Meiji years were less about the solitary vision of a teenage emperor and more about a collective struggle to redefine a nation. Japan's journey from isolation to integration was filled with enough drama, comedy, and head-scratching moments to fill a season of historical retellings. Through it all, Meiji remained a steadfast figurehead, a symbol of change in a world that was being reinvented from the ground up. And as Japan took its first steps into the modern age, it's clear that the path was as winding and unpredictable as the minds that charted it. And so, as Japan stepped boldly, or perhaps clumsily, into the modern age, the Meiji government faced the Herculean task of transforming an economy that had been rooted in rice and rigid social hierarchies. Let's just say, for the feudal samurai class, the transition to modernization was as jarring as a cat being dunked in water. These warriors, once revered as the epitome of honor and martial prowess, were now being asked to do the unthinkable, pay taxes. Cue the collective gasp. You see, the samurai had long been the pampered elite of Japanese society, living off stipends provided by their feudal lords. It was a cushy setup, like having a lifetime supply of avocado toast without the hassle of a mortgage. But with the Meiji Restoration came a seismic economic shake-up, the 1873 land tax reform. This new policy was as popular as a Shakespearean play at a punk rock concert, especially among those accustomed to the old ways. Let's break it down. The original land tax system was based on rice production. Makes sense, right? Rice was currency, sustenance, and status. But the Meiji government, aiming to standardize and stabilize revenue, decided to base taxes on land value instead. This was a revolutionary move, akin to switching from bartering with goats to dealing in cold, hard cash. The tax rate was set at 3% of the land's value, a figure that was supposed to bring predictability and modernity to the fiscal system. But for landowners, it felt more like a swindle than a savvy economic strategy. Implementation of this new tax system was nothing short of a comedy of errors. Imagine the bewilderment of samurai, who had spent their lives perfecting the art of swordsmanship, suddenly being thrust into the role of tax accountants. It was as if the government had handed samurai a calculator and said, "Good luck, and may the odds be ever in your favor." Many were left scratching their heads, wondering how to assess land value when their expertise lay in cutting down foes, not calculating fiscal returns. The chaos didn't stop there. The shift to a cash economy put a strain on those who had previously measured wealth in bushels of rice. The tax officials, eager to enforce the new system, often lacked the expertise to accurately estimate land values, leading to widespread inconsistencies and, predictably, resentment. In some cases, tax assessments were as arbitrary as a cat choosing a favorite human. The ensuing uproar was enough to send the government scrambling to tweak the system, eventually reducing the tax rate to 5% in 1877 to quell the unrest. But by then, the damage had been done, and the old guard was left feeling more than a little miffed. Meanwhile, as the samurai struggled to navigate this new economic landscape, the Meiji government was busy trying to juggle the demands of modernization with the deeply ingrained traditions of Japanese society. The introduction of Western-style dining is a case in point, a culinary culture clash that deserves its own sitcom. Imagine a nation where chopsticks had been the utensil of choice for centuries, suddenly being introduced to the bewildering array of forks, knives, and spoons. It was like asking a die-hard coffee drinker to switch to matcha lattes overnight. Official banquets turned into awkward affairs, with dignitaries attempting to balance Western dining etiquette with their chopstick-happy roots. The result? A dining room full of high-ranking officials who looked as perplexed as a cat in a dog show, fumbling with cutlery like they were handling live grenades. The government, determined to make the transition stick, went so far as to hold etiquette classes, like a crash course in how not to embarrass oneself at the dinner table. Yet, despite their best efforts, many a meal ended with a sigh of relief when the dessert course finally arrived, often a familiar bowl of rice, eaten with good old-fashioned chopsticks. But these culinary capers were just the tip of the iceberg. The broader challenge for the Meiji regime was to modernize the nation without losing its cultural soul. It was a balancing act worthy of an Olympic gymnast, and the stakes were high. The government's modernization drive was fueled by a need to compete with the Western powers, countries that were eyeing Japan like a prime piece of real estate. It was adapt or be swallowed up, and the pressure was on. Yet, for all the upheaval, there was a certain irony to the proceedings. The very traditions that had defined Japanese society for centuries were being reshaped by a young emperor who, not long ago, had been steeped in those same customs. Emperor Meiji himself was a symbol of this paradox, an emblem of modernity who had grown up in an era where change was as welcome as a thunderstorm at a tea party. As the Meiji era unfolded, Japan's journey toward modernization was marked by both triumph and tribulation. The economic reforms and cultural shifts that defined this period were nothing short of breathtaking, yet they were also riddled with challenges that tested the resolve of a nation caught between its storied past and an uncertain future. But isn't that the nature of progress? It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it's often riddled with moments that make you wonder if the whole endeavor was cooked up by a mischievous trickster with a penchant for chaos. And so, as we leave this chapter of the Meiji Restoration, we're left with a nation that was rapidly evolving, a people grappling with the demands of a new world, and an emperor who stood as a beacon of change amid the swirling tides of history. The story, far from over, promises more twists and turns as Japan continues its remarkable metamorphosis. Stay tuned. As Japan continued its whirlwind romance with westernization, cultural identity went through a dizzying spin cycle. It was like trying to teach a cat to bark, chaotic, occasionally hilarious, and a little bit unsettling. With Emperor Meiji at the helm, Japan was opening its doors to the West, a move that stirred up social upheavals and led to some downright comical attempts at cultural imitation. Let's talk about those flops, shall we? Picture this: a nation steeped in centuries of tradition suddenly trying to mimic Western customs with all the grace of a toddler in a tap dance class. It wasn't just about switching swords for suits. It was a full-on identity overhaul. Japanese officials, eager to present a modern face to the world, embraced Western fashion with gusto. But the transition wasn't always seamless. Imagine a samurai swapping his armor for a tailcoat, his katana replaced with a monocle. The result was often more slapstick than sophistication. The government, in its zealous quest for modernization, even mandated Western-style architecture. Suddenly, traditional Japanese buildings found themselves sprouting mansard roofs and Corinthian columns like awkward teenagers growing into their limbs. The infamous Rokumeken, a grandiose ballroom completed in 1883, became the epitome of Western elegance, or at least Japan's eager interpretation of it. This was where the elite would gather for Western-style social events, complete with waltzes and formal banquets. But here's the kicker. The guests were often more comfortable in tabai socks than in patent leather shoes, leading to some rather curious dance floor dynamics. And let's not forget the culinary culture clash. While chopsticks had served Japan perfectly well for ages, the introduction of Western dining utensils was met with a certain degree of trepidation. Forks, knives, and spoons were like alien artifacts, mystifying and slightly menacing. Yet, the Meiji government was determined to master these tools of modernity, even if it meant enduring a few awkward dinner parties. The scene was set for many a high-stakes meal, where etiquette classes were as crucial as the main course itself. Imagine Japanese dignitaries exchanging puzzled glances over a fork, their confusion palpable as they tried to navigate their plates without inadvertently launching peas at their dinner companions. Perhaps no aspect of Japanese life was more uniquely Meiji than his personal quirks and interests. Let's dive into the emperor's private world, where tradition met personal preference in delightful ways. Emperor Meiji was known for his love of sumo wrestling, a sport that had been a staple of Japanese culture long before the Western winds blew in. He was a frequent spectator, lending his imperial presence to matches that thrilled audiences and contestants alike. Sumo, with its deep roots in Shinto ritual, was a perfect blend of the old and the new, a reminder that even in the throes of modernization, some traditions were too cherished to fade away. And then there were the chopsticks. Not just any chopsticks, mind you, but a pair that stretched a staggering 15 inches. These legendary utensils were as much a part of Meiji's image as his reformist policies. While the Western world might have been all about forks and knives, Meiji made it clear that some aspects of Japanese culture were non-negotiable. These chopsticks were a testament to his ability to straddle two worlds, embracing the new while honoring the past. But don't be too quick to buy into the romanticized narrative of Meiji as an omniscient modernizer. While his reign was undoubtedly transformative, it was as much a story of trial and error as it was of triumph. For every successful reform, there was a policy that fell flat or backfired spectacularly. Take, for example, the infamous Enlightenment policies aimed at reshaping Japanese society. The government, in its enthusiasm, sometimes pushed too hard, too fast, leaving citizens bewildered and resistant. Consider the case of the education system overhaul. The Meiji government, eager to produce a literate and enlightened populace, implemented a nationwide school system, but the curriculum was a hodgepodge of Western ideas and traditional values, leaving students and their teachers struggling to reconcile the two. It was like trying to mix oil and water with predictably messy results. The emphasis on Western science and technology clashed with the Confucian ideals that had long underpinned Japanese education. The result? A generation caught between worlds, unsure of where their loyalties and identities lay. In truth, Meiji's modernization efforts were less about visionary leadership and more about pragmatic adaptation. Japan was facing the very real threat of colonization, and the emperor's policies were driven by necessity as much as innovation. The reforms, while ambitious, were often reactive, an attempt to keep pace with the rapidly changing global landscape. Yet, for all the missteps and miscalculations, the era's achievements were undeniable. The Meiji period saw Japan transform from a feudal society into a burgeoning industrial power. Railways crisscrossed the country, factories sprouted like mushrooms, and the economy shifted gears with a speed that left many breathless. By 1900, Japan had emerged as a force to be reckoned with, a nation that had rewritten its narrative in the span of a few decades. As we take stock of the Meiji era, it's clear that the story is far from over. This was a time of seismic change, marked by both absurdities and accomplishments. Emperor Meiji, with his unique blend of curiosity and caution, stood at the center of it all, guiding Japan through the choppy waters of modernization. But the journey is ongoing, and the next chapter promises to be just as compelling as the last. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the fascinating tale of Japan's transformation under the watchful eye of its most enigmatic emperor. As we dive headfirst into the late Meiji era, the real action unfolds on the battlefield rather than the ballroom. First up, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, a conflict that showcased Japan's newfound military prowess and its eagerness to flex its muscles on the international stage. The war was sparked by competing interests in Korea, a hot potato of geopolitical tension. Japan, having shed its feudal skin and donned the armor of modernity, was itching to prove itself, and it did just that. In a series of swift and decisive victories, Japan trounced the Qing dynasty, a powerhouse that had previously loomed large over East Asia. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in 1895, was the cherry on top, granting Japan control over Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands, along with a hefty indemnity of 200 million taels of silver. That's a cool 500 tons of silver, enough to build a small mountain of coins. This victory was more than just a military scalp. It was Japan's coming-out party on the global scene. The world suddenly sat up and took notice of this once reclusive archipelago that had transformed itself into a formidable player seemingly overnight. The win over China sent shockwaves through the international community and proved that Japan's modernization efforts were more than just window dressing. It was a stark reminder to the Western powers that Japan was no longer a passive observer in the game of empire. But Japan wasn't done yet. Fast forward to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905, a conflict that would further cement its place as a global power. When tensions over control of Manchuria and Korea boiled over, Japan once again went to war, this time with the Russian Empire. In a David versus Goliath matchup, Japan was the plucky underdog facing off against a European giant. Yet, through a combination of shrewd strategy and sheer tenacity, Japan emerged victorious, shocking the world once again. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905 was the crowning glory, where Admiral Togo Hayakairo led the Japanese fleet to a decisive victory, sinking or capturing most of the Russian Baltic fleet. It was a naval showdown that would make any Hollywood blockbuster proud, complete with torpedo attacks, booming artillery, and dramatic sea chases. The subsequent Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by President Theodore Roosevelt, a testament to the global significance of the conflict, saw Russia cede control of Port Arthur, the Liaodong Peninsula, and South Sakhalin to Japan, along with recognizing its interests in Korea. These victories were more than just military triumphs. They were proof of concept for Japan's modernization. The country had gone from a hermit kingdom to a major player on the world's stage in just a few decades. And while the romanticized narrative credits Emperor Meiji with masterminding this transformation, the truth is, his reign was less about singular genius and more about collective hustle. Meiji was indeed a symbol of this era, but he was no puppet master pulling all the strings. His legacy is built on the efforts of countless statesmen, military leaders, and everyday citizens who were just as invested in Japan's future as he was. Emperor Meiji's ability to ride the waves of change was as much about luck and timing as it was about foresight. He presided over a period of intense flux, where old traditions clashed with new ideas, and the path forward was anything but clear. Japan's rise was a comedy of errors that somehow worked out, a mad scramble that resulted in a nation both modernized and uniquely itself. The era was rife with contradictions, a country embracing Western science while fiercely preserving its cultural identity, a society that wanted to learn from the West but not become the West. This delicate balancing act was the hallmark of Meiji's reign. In the end, Meiji's legacy is a testament to the power of adaptability. His era was less about a single visionary leading the charge and more about a society that learned to pivot, improvise, and innovate in the face of rapid change. It's a story of a nation that found its footing by stumbling forward, of a leader who guided with a light touch, allowing the people to find their own path. And isn't that the crux of history? It's not always about the grand plans and master strategies. Often, it's about the messy, chaotic, and unpredictable journey that somehow leads to success. As we close the book on Emperor Meiji's remarkable reign, we're left with a Japan that had emerged from the shadows to become a beacon of modernization, a nation that had rewritten its destiny with equal parts ambition and bewilderment. Meiji's story is a reminder that progress is rarely straightforward, often requiring a mix of courage, curiosity, and a touch of chaos. His era was a wild ride, one that reshaped Japan and left an indelible mark on the world. So here's to Emperor Meiji, the modernizer who rode the waves of history with a steady hand, even if he occasionally found himself adrift in the unpredictable tides of change. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the man who would eventually become the founding father of modern Turkey, began his journey not in the grand halls of power, but in the modest streets of Salonika, now Thessaloniki in Greece. Born in 1881, a year that might not have screamed birth of a nation, but certainly was the starting point for one of the most transformative figures in modern history. His early years were wrapped in the fraying fabric of the Ottoman Empire, a once glorious giant now staggering under its own weight. And let's not forget, this empire was practically the IKEA of empires, constantly assembling and disassembling territories. Little Mustafa was sent to a religious school at first, a choice that was as much about practical education as it was about keeping the local imam happy. But young Mustafa wasn't having it. He convinced his folks to switch him to a more secular school, showcasing his knack for persuasion early on. Fast forward a few years, and he's off to the military academy in Istanbul, a place where dreams of glory met the grim reality of Ottoman bureaucracy. Picture this: a young cadet, uniform crisp, dreams unspoiled, navigating a system where paperwork piled higher than the empire's debts. By 1905, Mustafa Kemal had graduated from the Ottoman Military Academy as a lieutenant. He was part of a new generation of officers who thought the empire might just be salvageable if they could wrestle it away from the sclerotic hands of tradition. What was his secret weapon? His razor-sharp wit, of course, a tool he wielded as effectively as any sword or strategy. One of his favorite pastimes was skewering the inefficiency of the Ottoman administration with sardonic observations, much to the delight of his peers and the chagrin of his superiors. Take the time he critiqued a particularly convoluted military order, stating it had more twists and turns than the road to hell, without any of the scenic views. His superiors, perhaps not thrilled to be compared to infernal landscapes, found his humor a bit too cutting at times. But Mustafa knew that a little levity was essential when you're trying to modernize an empire that still thought telegrams were cutting-edge technology. His rise through the ranks was as much about his capability as it was about his ability to navigate the political minefields of the Ottoman military. By the time World War I rolled around, Mustafa Kemal had carved out a reputation as a strategic mastermind with a penchant for cutting through red tape like a hot knife through baklava. During the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, while the Allies thought they could waltz through the Dardanelles like they were on a leisurely Mediterranean cruise, Mustafa Kemal had other plans. He famously told his soldiers, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die," highlighting the dire stakes and relentless determination that marked his leadership style. And die they did in droves, but they also held the line, turning the tide of the battle. World War I wasn't just a proving ground for Mustafa Kemal, was a stage where he honed his skills in improvisation and resilience. While the Ottoman Empire was collapsing like a poorly assembled Ottoman coffee table, Mustafa was busy cementing his reputation. His peers called him Kemal the Scourge for his relentless tenacity and strategic brilliance. By 1916, he had been promoted to the rank of Pasha, a title which, let's face it, sounds a lot more glamorous than it actually was in an empire on the decline. Through it all, Mustafa was a master of the art of the comeback, not just in battle, but in conversation. Once, when questioned by a superior about his support for the Sultan, he quipped, "Support. I think the Sultan needs more than support, perhaps an entire scaffolding system." His humor was his armor, his way of coping with the absurdities of the empire he served and the world he was trying to reshape. This knack for turning a phrase wasn't just for show. It was a reflection of his intellectual rigor and strategic mind. He was a voracious reader, devouring works on philosophy, history, and science, always looking for ways to apply what he learned to the problems at hand. He knew that to truly modernize Turkey, he'd need more than just military victories. He'd need a cultural revolution, one that required both wit and wisdom. In the trenches and in military planning rooms, Mustafa Kemal was a force to be reckoned with. He navigated the chaos of World War I with a strategic mind that was as sharp as his wit. And while the Ottoman Empire crumbled around him, Mustafa was quietly laying the groundwork for something new, something revolutionary. His story, full of twists, turns, and more than a few sardonic observations, was just getting started. And if the empire was the Titanic, he was the one commandeering a lifeboat, figuring out how to keep it afloat amidst the waves of history. As the Ottoman Empire was doing its best impression of a collapsing Jenga tower, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was busily planning his next move, one that would eventually lead to the birth of modern Turkey. Enter the Turkish War of Independence, a period where Atatürk's name would become synonymous with strategic genius, and let's be honest, a tad bit of audacity. Now, imagine this. It's 1919, and the Treaty of Sevres has just diced up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving turkey at a family gathering where everyone brought a knife. The Allied powers were treating the remnants of the empire like a clearance sale, and Mustafa Kemal was not shopping. Instead, he was ready to flip the script. Atatürk set up shop in Samsun on May 19, 1919, a date that's now celebrated annually as the beginning of the Turkish War of Independence. And no, he didn't arrive with a grand army in tow or a parade of tanks. Instead, he had a handful of loyal officers and a steely determination that could chip granite. But here's where things get interesting. Atatürk knew he couldn't fight a traditional war with an unprepared, underfunded, and undermanned force. So, he decided to get creative. One of his most legendary tactics involved a bit of theatrical flair that would make any stage director proud. Facing Greek forces that were better equipped and numerically superior, Atatürk and his troops found themselves in a tight spot near the Sakarya River in 1921. Here, he deployed what could only be described as the ultimate bluff: fake soldiers. He had wooden dummies dressed in uniforms placed strategically to give the impression of a much larger force. It was the military equivalent of inflating your resume, and it worked. The Greek forces hesitated, giving Atatürk the precious time he needed to regroup and reinforce his real troops. But let's not get too swept away by the romanticism of trickery and wooden decoys. The reality was far grimmer. The Turkish troops were underfed, under-equipped, and facing a formidable enemy. Atatürk himself was juggling a precarious political situation, trying to unite disparate factions within Turkey while simultaneously convincing the Allies that this wasn't just some quixotic rebellion. It was a masterclass in multitasking, a skill that most of us struggle with when it comes to simply balancing work emails and family text chains. The Turkish War of Independence was as much a battle of wits as it was a physical confrontation. Atatürk had to navigate a labyrinth of political allegiances and rivalries. He needed to consolidate power, recruit soldiers, and somehow find the resources to sustain them. You could say he was spinning plates on a unicycle while juggling flaming torches, and he didn't even get a circus tent. Now, let's address the myth versus reality of Atatürk's leadership style during this period. The myth paints him as an unyielding hero, a figure of unwavering resolve. And while there's truth to his determination, the reality is that his leadership was often pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness. For instance, he was not above making difficult decisions that involved significant sacrifice. The Battle of Sakarya, which lasted from August to September 1921, was a brutal engagement where both sides suffered heavy casualties. Atatürk's strategy involved not just holding the line, but willingly allowing his forces to endure severe losses to achieve a larger strategic victory. The economic context of the war can't be ignored either. The financial state of the nascent Turkish nationalist movement was, to put it mildly, precarious. The fledgling government was operating on a shoestring budget, relying heavily on donations, loans, and whatever resources they could scrounge up. This was a time when every bullet counted, and every soldier had to make do with whatever rations could be scraped together. The budget was tighter than a pair of jeans after Thanksgiving dinner, yet somehow Atatürk managed to keep the machine running. In the end, it was a combination of strategic genius, political savvy, and a dash of bravado that secured victory. Atatürk's ability to rally his troops and inspire the nation was nothing short of extraordinary. By October 1922, the Turkish forces had decisively defeated the Greek army, leading to the eventual negotiation of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, a document that recognized the sovereignty of the newly formed Republic of Turkey. Atatürk's role in the Turkish War of Independence was not without controversy, though. His methods were sometimes seen as heavy-handed, his decisions occasionally polarizing, but history often demands such complexities from its most pivotal figures. The man at the helm of Turkey's revolutionary transformation was not a one-dimensional hero. He was a leader who understood the harsh necessities of his time. As the dust settled on the battlefield and the ink dried on international treaties, Atatürk was not just building a nation. He was crafting a new identity for his people. His leadership during the war was a testament to his strategic acumen and his ability to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of political and military realities. But don't get too comfortable, because the story of Atatürk doesn't end here. The Turkish War of Independence might have set the stage, but the real show was just beginning. With the establishment of the Republic, Atatürk would embark on a series of reforms that would redefine what it meant to be Turkish in the modern world. So, hang tight, because this roller coaster of history is far from over. And just like that, the curtain rose on a new act in the drama of Turkey's history. With the flick of a pen, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey officially came into existence, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was cast in his most challenging role yet, president. If leading a ragtag group of revolutionaries to victory had been a Herculean task, Founding and modernizing a nation from the ashes of an empire was akin to cleaning up after a particularly raucous house party, where the Ottoman Empire had left the place in shambles. First up on Atatürk's to-do list was to tackle the headgear. Yes, you heard that right. Hats became a national issue. The fez, that little red cap with a tassel, was as much a part of Ottoman identity as kebabs and bureaucratic red tape. But to Atatürk, it was a symbol of the old regime, and it had to go. In 1925, he introduced the hat law, effectively banning the fez. Now, don't underestimate this move. Changing hats might sound like a fashion faux pas, but it was a radical shift with cultural implications that ran deep. Imagine telling a cowboy to ditch his Stetson for a bowler hat. Sacrilege, right? But Atatürk was relentless in his quest for modernization, believing that outward appearances could influence inward change. The fez wasn't the only target on Atatürk's list. Next, he set his sights on the Turkish language itself. In 1928, he launched the alphabet revolution, swapping out the old Ottoman script, an intricate stew of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish elements, for a new Latin-based alphabet. This wasn't just a change in characters, it was a massive cultural overhaul. Literacy rates in the early 1920s were abysmally low, hovering around 10%, and Atatürk believed that simplifying the script could unlock literacy for the masses. It was a linguistic facelift designed to make reading and writing more accessible, and in the process, forge a stronger national identity. The reform was implemented with the kind of urgency usually reserved for fire drills, with Atatürk himself leading the charge like a charismatic teacher at the front of a classroom. Within a year, literacy rates began to climb, a testament to the effectiveness of his reform. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Atatürk had a whole menu of reforms, each more ambitious than the last. He overhauled the legal system, adopting secular laws to replace the religious codes of the Ottoman era. In a move that would make even the most radical reformers blush, he granted women the right to vote and hold public office in 1934, a full decade before France and Italy got around to it. It was a revolutionary act that put Turkey ahead of its time, positioning it as a beacon of progress in the region. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with Atatürk's whirlwind of change. His advisors often found themselves caught between admiration and bewilderment, trying to keep up with the rapid pace of transformation. One minute, they were discussing educational reforms. The next, they were drafting new laws on civil rights. It was the political equivalent of changing tires on a moving car, and not everyone had the stomach for it. Atatürk's vision for Turkey was clear. A secular, modern state, unshackled from the constraints of its Ottoman past. But achieving that vision required more than just policy changes. It required a cultural revolution. He championed the arts, encouraged Western music and theater, and even introduced the Gregorian calendar. Sundays became the official day of rest, aligning Turkey with Western nations and further distancing it from its Islamic calendar roots. Economically, Atatürk was no slouch either. He understood that a strong economy was the backbone of a strong nation. He implemented a series of economic reforms aimed at industrializing Turkey, reducing its dependence on agriculture. Railways, factories, and infrastructure projects sprouted up across the country like mushrooms after a rainstorm. It was an era of rapid modernization, with Turkey's GDP growing at an impressive rate of about 9% annually during the 1930s. Talk about making progress faster than you can say. Economic miracle. Yet, amid these sweeping changes, Atatürk remained a paradox. To some, he was a visionary leader dragging Turkey into the 20th century. To others, a ruthless autocrat who brooked no dissent. His reforms were often enforced with an iron will that left little room for opposition. Critics were silenced, sometimes through imprisonment, other times through less savory means. His approach to governance was a blend of charm and authority, tightrope walk between democracy and dictatorship. Atatürk's legacy is a study in contrasts. His reforms laid the foundations for a modern, secular Turkey, yet his methods were sometimes as controversial as they were effective. He was a man who understood the power of symbols, whether it was a hat, an alphabet, or a calendar. His ability to inspire and mobilize a nation was matched only by his capacity to intimidate and control. He was both a hero and a pragmatist, a leader who navigated the complexities of his time with a mix of charisma and calculated strategy. As the 1930s rolled into view, Atatürk's vision for Turkey was becoming a reality. The nation was on a path toward modernization, its citizens adapting to new customs and ideas with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resistance. The Republic of Turkey was no longer just a fledgling state. It was a bold experiment in nation-building, with Atatürk at the helm, steering it through uncharted waters. His reforms would continue to shape the country's identity long after his presidency, leaving a legacy as enduring as it is complex. But the story doesn't end here. There's more to uncover as the saga of Turkey's transformation continues. And so, as the 1930s marched on with the steady beat of progress and the occasional misstep, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk found himself in an intriguing new role, that of a statesman on the world stage. You see, building a nation from scratch is one thing, but carving out a spot for it in the turbulent international arena, well, that's a whole new ball game. Atatürk was about to prove that he wasn't just a master of domestic reform, but also a deft player in the geopolitical chess match of the early 20th century. Atatürk's international diplomacy was as strategic as a game of Risk, minus the plastic armies and dice rolls. He knew Turkey needed friends, or at least the kind of frenemies who wouldn't stab you in the back at the first opportunity. So, he set about crafting a foreign policy that was as much about survival as it was about asserting Turkey's newfound independence. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 had given Turkey the diplomatic breathing room it needed, but the global landscape was changing faster than you could say Great Depression. In 1932, Atatürk maneuvered Turkey into the League of Nations, that early attempt at world peace that was essentially a precursor to the United Nations, but with less influence and a penchant for looking the other way when things got dicey. Joining the League was a calculated move, a way to bolster Turkey's international legitimacy while also keeping an eye on European powers who might have designs on Turkish sovereignty. It was Atatürk's way of saying, we're here, we're modern, and we're not going back to being the sick man of Europe. But Atatürk's diplomatic efforts weren't limited to dusty conference rooms and endless negotiations. Oh no. He knew the power of a good party, and his soirees were legendary. Picture this: diplomats and dignitaries mingling in Ankara, the air thick with tobacco smoke and intrigue, while Atatürk held court with his characteristic charm and wit. These gatherings weren't just about clinking glasses and toasting to good health. They were strategic opportunities to rub elbows with the global elite and subtly influence international opinion. Atatürk had a knack for using humor to disarm his guests, employing quips that left them either laughing or scrambling to figure out if they'd just been insulted. One famous anecdote involves a French ambassador who asked about Turkey's political climate. Atatürk reportedly replied, "Well, it's like a French wine, complex, a bit unpredictable but ultimately satisfying." Whether the ambassador got the joke or not, who can say? But it set the tone for the kind of diplomacy Atatürk was known for. Sharp, strategic, and just a tad cheeky. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephants. The rise of fascism in Europe was a growing concern, and Atatürk was acutely aware of the shifting sands of power. With Adolf Hitler's rise in Germany and Benito Mussolini's antics in Italy, the geopolitical landscape was starting to look like a powder keg with a very short fuse. Atatürk's response: a delicate balancing act that would make a tightrope walker proud. Turkey's foreign policy during this period was one of neutrality, but not the kind where you sit on the fence and hope no one notices. Atatürk was actively engaging with neighboring countries to build a network of alliances that could act as a buffer against the encroaching storm. The Balkan Pact of 1934, for instance, was a defensive alliance with Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia, an agreement that was as much about regional stability as it was about sending a message to the fascist regimes that Turkey was not to be trifled with. Atatürk's diplomatic style was as multifaceted as it was effective. He understood that Turkey couldn't afford to alienate any potential allies, yet he was keenly aware of the need to assert Turkey's sovereignty and independence. His approach was a mix of pragmatism and principle, a balancing act that required constant attention to the shifting dynamics of international politics. But let's not pretend Atatürk's later years were all about serious statesmanship. No, the man knew how to enjoy life and his legendary parties were a testament to that. These weren't just diplomatic events, they were spectacles, complete with music, laughter, and the occasional impromptu dance. Atatürk was known to indulge in raki, that potent anise-flavored spirit that could loosen even the tightest of tongues. His ability to charm and entertain was as much a part of his leadership as any policy or reform. Yet, amid the revelry, Atatürk never lost sight of his goals. Each clink of a glass, each shared joke, was a step toward solidifying Turkey's place on the global stage. He knew that diplomacy wasn't just about treaties and agreements. It was about relationships, about building a network of allies who could be counted on when the chips were down. Behind the scenes, Atatürk's health was beginning to wane, though he kept it largely under wraps. The man who had reshaped a nation was facing his own personal battles, but he remained as committed as ever to Turkey's future. His later years were a testament to his resilience and determination, a period of intense activity that belied the toll it was taking on his body. As the 1930s drew to a close, the world was on the brink of another conflict that would make the Great War look like a minor skirmish. Atatürk's efforts to navigate this turbulent era were a masterclass in diplomacy, a blend of charm, strategy, and the occasional well-timed quip that left an indelible mark on international relations. His legacy as a statesman was as complex and multifaceted as the man himself, a testament to his ability to balance the serious with the sublime. And so, the story of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk continued to unfold, a tale of transformation, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of a vision for Turkey that would endure long after his time. But there's still more to explore in this saga of nation-building, leadership, and the enduring impact of one man's dream, a story that is far from over. As the final act of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's life played out, the world was teetering on the edge of World War II, an ominous symphony of political tension and military might. But Atatürk, ever the maestro of modernity, had one last performance to orchestrate, securing his legacy while ensuring Turkey navigated the coming storm with its sovereignty intact. His health was failing, a fact he concealed with the same determination he applied to national reforms. After all, the man who had defied empires was not about to let something as trivial as mortality slow him down. Atatürk's reforms had turned Turkey into a secular republic, a transformation as radical as swapping a horse-drawn carriage for a Model T. But these changes, revolutionary in their scope, sparked as much controversy as they did progress. The Hat Law, the Alphabet Revolution, and the empowerment of women were more than just policies. They were bold statements of intent, declarations that Turkey would not be a prisoner of its past. Yet, beneath these achievements lay the gritty truth that change is never clean-cut. For every step forward, there were missteps, resistance, and the enduring tug of tradition. Take, for example, the cultural shockwaves of the Alphabet Revolution. While it ignited a swift rise in literacy rates, it also severed ties with the Ottoman past, leaving generations disconnected from their history. Imagine waking up one day to find that your bookshelf had become a museum of incomprehensible hieroglyphs. This linguistic overhaul was not just a practical move. It was a symbolic cleaving from an identity that had defined Turks for centuries. It was a gamble that paid off in terms of modernization, but at the cost of cultural continuity, an irony not lost on those who had to relearn their own language overnight. Economically, Atatürk's policies were akin to building a skyscraper on a swamp. The goal was to industrialize and move away from an agrarian economy, a task Herculean in scale given the shoestring budget. By the end of the 1930s, Turkey's GDP was growing at an impressive rate, an echo of a nation catching its breath after sprinting towards modernity. Yet, this economic renaissance was marred by the reality that not everyone shared in its prosperity. Rural areas lagged behind urban centers, creating a chasm between the glittering promise of the new Turkey and the gritty reality of its old heartlands. Politically, Atatürk's rule was a masterclass in balancing progress with pragmatism. His government was a curious blend of democracy and autocracy, a tightrope act that kept dissent in check while pursuing modernization with relentless zeal. Critics were silenced, often with a swiftness that would make a guillotine blush, a reflection of Atatürk's belief that the ends justified the means. The man who led a nation to independence was not above using an iron fist to maintain the republic he had built from the ruins of an empire. And then there's the mythology that surrounds Atatürk, a tapestry woven as much from fact as from the threads of national narrative. He's hailed as the father of the Turks, a modern-day Prometheus who brought fire to his people in the form of secularism and progress. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find a man as complex as the era he lived in, a leader capable of both visionary reforms and authoritarian control. The myth paints him as an unwavering hero, a beacon of modernity, yet the reality reveals a figure who was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it. Atatürk's legacy is a study in contradictions, a reflection of a country caught between East and West, past and future. His reforms laid the groundwork for a secular state, yet their implementation often required the very authoritarianism he sought to dismantle. He championed women's rights and education, yet his methods were sometimes as harsh as they were effective, leaving a legacy that continues to stir debate. Even today, Atatürk's presence looms large in Turkey. His image adorns currency, his speeches are studied in schools, and his mausoleum in Ankara remains a site of pilgrimage. But history, ever the trickster, has a way of glossing over the rough edges. The romantic narratives often overshadow the grim realities of governance and change. Atatürk was not just a statue in a square. He was a man with the flaws and foresight that define all great leaders. As Turkey navigates the complexities of the 21st century, Atatürk's influence remains palpable. His vision of a secular, modern republic continues to shape the country's policies and identity, even as new challenges arise. The debates over his methods and their impact persist, a testament to the enduring relevance of his legacy. Was he a liberator or a dictator, a visionary or a pragmatist? The answer, as with all historical figures, is not so easily pinned down. In the end, Atatürk's story is a reminder that history is never a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a complex tapestry of ambition, struggle, and the relentless pursuit of a vision, one that is as messy as it is magnificent. His legacy is not just in the reforms he enacted or the nation he forged from the ashes of an empire. It is in the ongoing dialogue about what it means to lead, to reform, and to dream of a better future. And so, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's journey comes to a close not with a definitive conclusion, but with the understanding that his legacy, like the man himself, is a living thing, evolving, debated, and ever relevant. As Turkey continues to grow and change, so too does the conversation about Atatürk's place in history, a dialogue as dynamic and enduring as the republic he founded. If you ever find yourself sauntering through the streets of modern-day Mexico City, pause for a moment. Beneath the hustle and bustle of one of the world's largest urban sprawls, there's the whisper of a past so grand and ambitious it could make even the most jaded time traveler sit up and take notice. Welcome to the world of the Aztecs, folks, where the streets were once canals, the economy was as complex as a soap opera, and the emperors had more bling than a modern-day rap mogul. The Aztecs knew how to build a city. Tenochtitlan, their crown jewel, was founded in 1325 on an island in Lake Texcoco. And by island, I mean a swampy, inhospitable patch of land most would look at and say, "Nah, I'll pass." But not the Aztecs. They saw potential. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and Tenochtitlan was a sprawling metropolis, home to around 200,000 people by the early 1500. That's more than most European cities at the time. Think Venice meets New York City, with a dash of ancient Egyptian pyramid-building muscles. Speaking of pyramids, the Aztecs had a thing for them. They built towering temples dedicated to their gods, with the Templo Mayor standing as the piece de resistance. This bad boy was the spiritual heart of Tenochtitlan, a place where priests got their cardio by climbing the temple stairs and cutting out hearts. Religious fervor aside, it was a feat of engineering that would have made the Romans nod in approval. Now, let's talk about the economy. The Aztec economy was the kind of complex, interconnected beast that made modern stock markets look like a lemonade stand. It was all about the tribute system. Here's how it worked. The Aztecs would conquer neighboring city-states, and instead of being your typical oppressive overlords, they'd just say, "Hey, pay us tribute, and we won't ruin your day." This tribute came in all forms: food, textiles, precious stones, and even warriors. It was a clever way to keep the empire fat and happy without the need for constant warfare. So, who was running this show? At the top of the food chain was the emperor, or Huey T. Latoni, which translates to Great Speaker. The title might sound like something you'd give to a motivational guru, but make no mistake, this guy was the real deal. He had absolute power, but he also had to keep the nobles happy and the tribute flowing. It was a delicate balancing act, kind of like being a modern-day CEO, but with a lot more feathers and human sacrifices. Beneath the emperor, society was a well-oiled machine with its own intricate hierarchy. At the top were the nobles, or Pippleton, who lived in lavish homes and enjoyed the finer things in life. Below them were the commoners, or Macehualton, who were the real backbone of the empire. They were the farmers, the warriors, the craftsmen, the ones who got things done while the nobles were busy admiring their own reflections in obsidian mirrors. Life for the average Aztec was a mix of hard work, religious devotion, and the occasional day off for a festival. These festivals were epic affairs, complete with music, dancing, and more food than you could shake a stick at. But after the party, it was back to work, because those pyramids weren't going to build themselves, and the emperor's wardrobe wasn't going to fill itself with feathers and gold. Now, over the horizon, or more accurately, across the ocean, comes a fellow by the name of Hernan Cortés. If the Aztecs were the cool kids on the block, Cortés was the new kid who showed up with an attitude and a questionable fashion sense. In 1519, he landed on the coast with a ragtag group of about 600 men, some horses, and a handful of artillery that would give any medieval knight a complex. Cortés wasn't just some tourist looking for a good time. He was on a mission to find gold and glory, preferably both. The impending clash of cultures was about as subtle as a bull in a china shop, and let's just say it didn't exactly end with a friendly handshake, but that's a story for another time. For now, let's leave our Aztec friends in their bustling city, blissfully unaware of the storm that's brewing on the horizon. Because history, as they say, is written by the victors, but it's also full of twists, turns, and lessons that even the most seasoned historian couldn't predict. So, with the curtain about to rise on one of history's most dramatic showdowns, let's turn our attention to that fateful year of 1519. Hernan Cortés, who wasn't exactly the poster child for diplomatic relations, landed on the coast of what is now Mexico, and he wasn't there to exchange recipes. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood drop-by. It was more like an impromptu house party where the guests helped themselves to the silverware. Cortés, with his band of 600 adventurers, a few cannons, and some horses that the locals probably thought were some sort of mythical creature, was ready to make his mark. Arriving on the scene, Cortés quickly realized that the Aztecs weren't universally beloved. Who would have thought that demanding tribute and cutting out hearts might ruffle some feathers? Enter the disgruntled local tribes, eyeing this European wild card as their ticket to freedom. The Tlaxcalans, in particular, were like, "Hey, maybe this armored guy with a weird beard can help us shake off the Aztec yoke." And so, alliances began to form. Now, let's not pretend these alliances were built on trust and friendship. This was more like a reality TV alliance, shaky, self-serving, and likely to implode at any moment. But as far as Cortés was concerned, any friend of his enemy was a friend of his. The Tlaxcalans, seasoned warriors themselves, or a golden opportunity to topple their Aztec overlords, and figured the enemy of their enemy could borrow their sword. Cortés, with his newfound allies, was like a kid in a candy store, except the candy was military manpower and local knowledge. Speaking of knowledge, or the lack thereof, let's talk about the infamous meeting between Cortés and Montezuma Roman II. Picture this. Montezuma, the Huey T. Latoni, a man used to being treated like a demigod, and Cortés, a man who thought himself at least equal to that. It's a wonder the universe didn't implode from the sheer force of their egos. When they finally met, it was a clash of titans, both metaphorically and culturally. Montezuma, perhaps swayed by the confusing prophecies of Quetzalcoatl's return, treated Cortés with a mix of awe and caution. The Spaniards' arrival was seen by some as the fulfillment of a prophecy, a narrative that sounds like the plot of an epic fantasy novel. But let's be real here. Cortés wasn't exactly descending from the heavens on a feathered serpent. He was more like a land-grabbing entrepreneur with a penchant for conquest. The cultural misunderstandings were plentiful, and let's face it, quite absurd. Cortés interpreted Montezuma's deference as submission, while Montezuma might have thought he was just being polite to a potentially dangerous guest. There was no Rosetta Stone for translating Spanish swagger into Nahuatl nuance. Montezuma offered gifts, perhaps as a gesture of goodwill or an attempt to appease the newcomers. Cortés, meanwhile, saw these gifts not as tokens of hospitality, but as down payments on the Aztec treasury. This meeting of minds, or rather the lack of it, was a comedy of errors with tragic consequences. Imagine the scene. Montezuma rolls out the red carpet, and Cortés, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, decides to take it as an invitation to walk all over it. The Spaniards, with their clunky armor and shiny steel, must have looked like aliens to the Aztecs. And let's not forget the horses, four-legged beasts that could outrun anything seen before, likely adding to the mystical aura Cortés projected, whether intended or not. Amidst this confusion, Cortés made a bold, some might say reckless, decision. He took Montezuma hostage in his own palace, a move that would make any chess player proud. Checkmate indeed. This wasn't just a strategic maneuver, it was a masterclass in audacity. Montezuma was transformed from a revered ruler to a puppet, with Cortés pulling the strings. If you're thinking Stockholm Syndrome, you're not far off. The Aztec emperor was caught between a rock and a conquistador, and the empire was teetering on the edge. Now, the Aztecs were no strangers to warfare, but this was different. Their usual tactics didn't account for a foe that seemed to defy their understanding of warfare or reality. The Spaniards' steel weapons and armor were game changers, and their tactics were unlike anything the Aztecs had faced. Cortés leveraged this to his advantage, playing local rivals against each other like a seasoned puppet master. The seeds of chaos were sown, and the stage was set for an epic struggle. Aztecs, with their fiercely hierarchical society, were about to face an upheaval they couldn't have seen coming. The initial encounters between Cortés and the Aztecs were more than just a clash of civilizations. They were a collision of worlds, with each side struggling to comprehend the other's motives and methods. So, as our tale unfolds, we leave Cortés in the palace with Montezuma under his thumb, local tribes rallying to the Spanish cause, and an empire on the brink of unraveling. The story isn't over, not by a long shot. The storm has only just begun, and the winds of change are about to sweep through the heart of the Aztec Empire with a force no prophecy could have predicted. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is going to be a wild ride through history's most turbulent terrain. As the wheels of history turned with a creak and a groan, Cortés found himself riding the wave of fate toward Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. With Montezuma under his thumb and indigenous allies at his side, he was like a poker player with a suspiciously good hand. The road to Tenochtitlan was not paved with roses, but with the ambitions of a conquistador and the desperation of subjugated tribes eager for an Aztec downfall. The journey was a spectacle of its own. Picture a parade of Spanish soldiers, clanking in their steel armor, alongside Tlaxcalan and other indigenous warriors, each a living testament to the precarious nature of their alliance. Among them, the horses, those magnificent, terrifying beasts that seemed plucked straight from a legend, thundered across the landscape. To the Aztecs, these creatures were as alien as flying saucers would be today. Yet the real shocker wasn't the horses, it was the Spanish technology. Firearms were a game changer, and not just in the way a new iPhone changes your social standing at a party. We're talking about the kind of technology that made Aztec warriors, armed with obsidian blades and tartan armor, feel like they brought a slingshot to a cannon fight. The Spanish didn't have many guns, but the ones they did have were enough to create confusion and fear. Imagine the sound of gunpowder, a roaring crack that seemed to split the earth, and the dense, acrid smoke that followed. For the Aztecs, unaccustomed to such warfare, it was nothing short of a supernatural event. But technology wasn't the only invisible ally riding with Cortés. Enter smallpox, the ultimate Trojan horse. While Cortés and his men were making their way to the capital, this microscopic invader was quietly doing its work, spreading devastation through the densely packed city of Tenochtitlan. Now, I know what you're thinking. Weren't the Spanish just superior warriors? Let's bust that myth right open. The Aztecs were formidable fighters, but diseases like smallpox didn't play fair. They didn't care about skill or bravery. They leveled the playing field with a brutal efficiency that would have made any general envious. The impact was catastrophic. The city, which had once thrived with around 200,000 residents, began to empty as the disease tore through the population, claiming lives indiscriminately. Bernardino de Sahagun, a Spanish friar and chronicler, wrote of the chaos and despair, noting how many died of it, and many others died of hunger. It's the kind of ugly truth that puts a damper on any romantic notions about conquest. As the Spanish forces approached, the tension in Tenochtitlan was palpable. The city, with its grand temples and bustling marketplaces, was on the brink. Cortés and his allies reached its outskirts, and the sight was something to behold. A city on an island, connected to the mainland by causeways, like a jewel set in a crown. The Aztecs had built a marvel, but that marvel was about to become a battleground. The siege of Tenochtitlan was a brutal affair, lasting nearly 3 months from May to August 1521. Cortés, true to his less-than-subtle style, cut off the city's water and food supplies, turning the causeways from lifelines into nooses. The Aztecs, under the leadership of the new emperor Cuauhtémoc, Montezuma's successor, and a warrior with a spine of steel, fought back with everything they had. But the odds were stacked against them. Their traditional warfare, which focused on capturing enemies for sacrifice rather than outright annihilation, was no match for Spanish tactics that prioritized total destruction. Primary accounts from conquistadors like Bernal Diaz del Castillo provide haunting glimpses into the siege. Diaz, with a penchant for dramatic storytelling, described the Aztecs' resilience, noting how they fought us day and night, and we could not advance a step without bloodshed. It was a fight fueled by desperation, as much about survival as it was about honor. The siege saw the Spaniards employing brigantines, small ships constructed with the help of local allies, to control the lake and harass the city's defenders. These floating fortresses were a testament to Cortés's resourcefulness and audacity. The Aztecs, meanwhile, did what they could, using their knowledge of the city and the terrain to their advantage. They fought in the streets, on the rooftops, turning their home into a fortress. But disease, starvation, and the relentless pressure of the siege began to take their toll. The city that had once stood as the heart of an empire was crumbling, its people pushed to the brink. Cortés, perhaps sensing that the end was near, offered terms of surrender. Cuauhtémoc, embodying the spirit of his people, refused. Surrender was not in the Aztec vocabulary, not in the face of such overwhelming odds. In the end, it wasn't just steel and gunpowder that brought Tenochtitlan to its knees. It was a confluence of events, technological disparity, disease, and the exploitation of local rivalries that sealed its fate. The myth of Spanish superiority is just that, a myth. Yes, they had advantages, but without the help of indigenous allies and the ravages of disease, their conquest would have been a much tougher sell. As the dust settled, Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. The city, once the center of a vibrant empire, was now a shadow of its former self. The fall of Tenochtitlan was more than a military defeat. It was the end of a world, a way of life that had thrived for centuries. For the Aztecs, it was a tragedy of epic proportions, a story of resistance, resilience, and ultimately loss. Yet, amidst the rubble and the ruin, the legacy of the Aztecs endured. Their culture, their achievements, and their spirit lived on, even as the Spanish began to reshape the land in their image. They say history is written by the victors, but the story of the Aztecs is one that refuses to be silenced, echoing through time as a testament to their enduring legacy. And so, the saga of the Aztec Empire continues, with lessons that resonate even today. The next chapter beckons, promising new revelations and insights into a world that, while gone, is far from forgotten. Stay tuned, because the past has a way of surprising us, even when we think we know it all. As the sun set on the Aztec Empire, the echoes of its grandeur lingered in the ruinous silence of Tenochtitlan. This was a city that had once thrummed with the vibrant pulse of an empire, now reduced to a battleground's aftermath. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 wasn't just a collapse. It was a seismic shift, a tectonic realignment of power, culture, and destiny. The Aztecs, led by the resolute Cuauhtémoc, had fought with grit and tenacity, their defense showcasing a resilience that could rival any epic tale. But even the mightiest warriors couldn't hold back the tide of change when it came crashing down with the force of steel, disease, and betrayal. With the city in Spanish hands, Cortés didn't waste time declaring his new dominion. He was like a kid in a candy store, except the candy was cities, and the store was an entire continent. And so began the transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. It was less a makeover and more a bulldozing of the old to make way for the new. The Spanish saw opportunity everywhere, every stone, every canal, every piece of gold, and they were ready to capitalize on it. The Spanish imposition of rule was swift and unforgiving, a stark reminder that for the conquerors, mercy was a foreign concept. They dismantled the Aztec structures, both literal and societal, replacing temples with churches, Nahuatl with Spanish, and the intricate Aztec calendar with the Gregorian. It was cultural colonization at its finest, or worst, depending on which side of the sword you found yourself on. The new rulers brought their own brand of bureaucracy, which was about as welcome as a mosquito at a nudist colony. The encomienda system was introduced, a delightfully exploitative arrangement where the Spanish crown granted colonists the right to forced labor from the indigenous people. In return, the encomenderos, those lucky enough to be granted such rights, were supposed to offer protection and religious instruction. Spoiler alert, the system was more about extracting wealth and less about saving souls. The region's transformation into New Spain was not just a cultural upheaval, but an economic one. The Spanish were adept at squeezing wealth from their new territories, and the Aztecs, with their rich veins of silver and gold, were a jackpot. By the mid-16th century, the Zacatecas silver mines had turned into the crown jewels of Spanish America, producing millions of pesos worth of silver annually. It was like striking oil in Texas, except instead of oil, it was silver, and instead of cowboys, you had conquistadors. But let's not romanticize this economic wonderland. The indigenous population paid the price, quite literally, as they were coerced into labor under harsh conditions. The irony here is thicker than a Spanish shipload of silver. Conquistadors who came to escape the rigid class structures of Europe wound up replicating those very systems, becoming new overlords in a new world. It's as if the Spanish Empire looked at the Aztec tribute system and thought, hey, that's a neat trick. Let's use that, but add more suffering. Religious conversion was another cornerstone of Spanish rule. The conquistadors had brought along Franciscan friars, who were on a mission to save souls, one forced baptism at a time. They tore down Aztec temples, using the stones to build churches, a symbolic act of religious prowess. The Templo Mayor was leveled, and in its place rose the Metropolitan Cathedral, a monument to the new spiritual order. But let's be clear, this wasn't a peaceful transition of faith. It was more like a divine hostile takeover, with the friars playing the part of spiritual repo men. Despite the heavy hand of conquest, the indigenous culture proved stubbornly resilient. The Nahua people, ever resourceful, adapted to the New World Order with a blend of resistance and assimilation. They incorporated elements of Catholicism into their own spiritual practices, creating a syncretic faith that lives on in Mexico to this day. It's like mixing oil and water, but somehow getting tequila, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Aztec legacy. The irony of the conquest is that the Spanish, who sought to civilize the so-called savages, ended up adopting many of their customs and foods. The Aztec diet, rich with corn, beans, and chili peppers, became staples in Spanish cuisine. Chocolate, once reserved for Aztec nobility, became a European obsession. It's as if the conquerors, in their attempt to erase a culture, found themselves seduced by its offerings. As the dust settled on this new chapter of history, the former Aztec Empire was reshaped in the image of its conquerors. But beneath the veneer of Spanish dominance, the heart of the Aztec civilization continued to beat, its rhythms echoing through the streets of Mexico City. This was a place where the past and present collided, creating a tapestry as rich and complex as the land itself. The Spanish had succeeded in their conquest, but at what cost? The land they claimed was haunted by the specters of those who had built it, those who had fought for it, and those who had been consumed by it. The transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City was not just the birth of New Spain. It was the beginning of a new era, one built on the ruins of another, where the lines between conqueror and conquered blurred amidst the chaos of history. Stay tuned, because the story of New Spain is just getting started. As the Spanish consolidated their power and the indigenous peoples adapted to their new reality. The stage was set for further intrigue, conflict, and cultural fusion. The legacy of the Aztecs, though battered, was far from broken, and the next chapter promises to illuminate the enduring impact of a civilization that, against all odds, refused to be forgotten. As the Spanish settled into their newly minted empire, the echoes of Tenochtitlan's grandeur lingered in the very bones of Mexico City. The Aztec Empire, though physically dismantled, refused to vanish into the annals of history. Instead, it seeped into the cultural fabric of the land, influencing everything from language to cuisine. You see, the Aztecs might have lost the battle, but their legacy was like a stubborn stain, impossible to wash out and richer than any tapestry the Spaniards could weave. The Spanish, in their quest for dominion, found themselves in a curious dance with the very culture they sought to dominate. Take the Mexican language, for instance. While Spanish became the dominant tongue, Nahuatl words slipped through the cracks, sneaking into everyday conversation. Words like chocolate, tomato, and avocado made their way across the Atlantic, spicing up European vocabularies and diets. It's as if the Aztec spirit whispered in every syllable, reminding the world of its enduring presence. And then there's the food. Let's talk tortillas. The Spanish might have introduced wheat, but corn was, and still is, the king of the kitchen. The humble tortilla, a staple of the Aztec diet, became a culinary cornerstone, a testament to the resilience of indigenous traditions. The fusion of Spanish and Aztec cuisines gave birth to modern Mexican food, tacos, tamales, and mole, each dish a delicious reminder of a past that refused to be erased. But beyond the palate lies the heart of the matter, identity. The mestizo, a blend of indigenous and Spanish ancestry, emerged as a symbol of cultural fusion. This new identity was a living testament to the complex tapestry of conquest and coexistence. The mestizo population grew, embodying the duality of a nation born from conflict yet thriving in diversity. It's a story of transformation, where the lines between oppressor and oppressed blurred into a shared narrative. Yet, the romantic notion of harmonious blending is only half the story. The reality was, and still is, a tapestry woven with threads of inequality and resistance. The encomienda system gave way to haciendas, and the indigenous population continued to face exploitation and marginalization. Land, once held collectively by indigenous communities, was parceled out to Spanish settlers, creating a legacy of land disputes that echoes through Mexican history. It's a reminder that while history is often presented as a series of victorious conquests, it's also rife with the struggles of those who lived beneath its shadow. The Spanish conquest left a scar on the land, but it also paved the way for a new kind of resilience. The indigenous peoples, far from being passive victims of history, adapted and resisted. They preserved their traditions, languages, and beliefs, often in the face of relentless pressure to conform. This cultural tenacity is evident in Mexico's vibrant festivals, music, and dance, each a celebration of identity and a defiance against the erasure of history. Fast forward to modern Mexico, and the legacy of the Aztec Empire is still palpable. The ruins of Tenochtitlan lie beneath the bustling streets of Mexico City, a constant reminder of the past. The Aztec calendar, an intricate system that once marked the passage of time, finds new life in cultural symbols and national pride. The image of the Aztec eagle, once a symbol of imperial power, now graces the Mexican flag, a testament to the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be forgotten. But let's not paint an overly romantic picture. The legacy of the Aztecs is as complex as the jungle of historical narratives it navigates. It's a story of survival and adaptation, of triumph and tragedy. The clash of cultures, Spanish and Aztec, was not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a multifaceted saga of human ambition, greed, and resilience. And what can we, the modern wanderers of history, learn from this epic tale? In a world still grappling with cultural clashes and imperial echoes, the story of the Aztecs offers a vivid lesson on the perils and possibilities of conquest. It's a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power can fracture societies, yet also a hopeful reminder of how cultures can blend, adapt, and create something new and unexpected. The fall of the Aztec Empire and the rise of New Spain underscore the importance of acknowledging both the beauty and brutality of history. It's a reminder that while empires may fall, their stories, and the lessons they carry, endure. As we navigate our own modern challenges, the echoes of Tenochtitlan remind us that resilience and adaptation are as vital now as they were centuries ago. So, as you stroll through the bustling streets of Mexico City or savor the rich flavors of Mexican cuisine, remember the Aztecs. Remember their achievements, their struggles, and their enduring legacy. History is not just a collection of dates and events. It's a living narrative that shapes our present and influences our future. The Aztecs may have fallen, but their spirit lives on, woven into the very fabric of Mexican identity and culture. And that, dear friends, is a legacy worth celebrating. Julius Caesar's story doesn't begin with a grand battle or a dramatic betrayal. Instead, it kicks off with an unlikely twist, a teenage priest giggling in the shadows of Rome's temples. Yes, it's hard to imagine the future dictator of Rome in a toga offering sacrifices to Jupiter, but that's exactly where young Caesar started out. Now, don't get too caught up in the religious fervor here. Caesar's stint as a priest was more political theater than spiritual awakening. 16, following the death of his father, he inherited the title of Flame Diales, a fancy way of saying junior priest. And what did this gig pay? Not much in coins, but plenty in connections. You see, Caesar's early years were less about divine inspiration and more about navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Rome in 85 BC was a hotbed of intrigue, with power slipping between the hands of the elite like a greased pig at a Roman feast. And if you were anyone in Roman society, you had to choose a side. For Caesar, that side was the populares, a party championing the common people, which was ironic given that the party was often led by aristocrats. But hey, who said politics was straightforward? Now, how did Caesar get tangled up with the populares? Enter Cornelia, his first wife. This wasn't just a marriage. It was more like a merger, brokered to solidify his ties with the populares. Cornelia was the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, the big man on campus for the populares and a sworn enemy of Sulla, another Roman heavy hitter. Marrying Cornelia was a bold move that effectively painted a target on Caesar's back. Sulla wasn't exactly the forgiving type, and when he took power, Caesar was ordered to divorce Cornelia. This was less of a suggestion and more of a command, but Caesar, in a move that foreshadows his future defiance, refused. Sulla's response: a hit list. Caesar fled Rome, smartly choosing self-preservation over a doomed showdown. Sulla's eventual pardon of Caesar supposedly came with a prophetic warning. In this young man there is many a Marius. And that, my friends, is what the Romans called foreshadowing. But for now, let's leave the eerie premonitions and focus on Caesar's next hair-raising adventure, his encounter with pirates. Yes, pirates, and not the Johnny Depp kind. These were the real deal, the kind who made the Mediterranean a nightmare for travelers. In 75 BC, Caesar, thinking a little sabbatical was in order, set sail to study in Rhodes. Instead of philosophical musings, he got kidnapped by Cilician pirates. These guys demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, about 620 kilograms, or nearly $600,000 in today's money. But Caesar, ever the showman, laughed in their faces and insisted they were undervaluing him. He demanded they ask for 50 talents instead. Yep, that's Caesar for you, turning a hostage situation into a negotiation seminar. The pirates, perplexed but amused, agreed. During his captivity, Caesar treated the pirates like his personal entourage, shushing them when he wanted to nap and even joining in on their games. He promised them, with all the charm of a future tyrant, that once freed, he would hunt them down and crucify them. They took it as a joke. Spoiler, it wasn't. Once the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar raised a fleet, chased the pirates, captured them, and true to his word had them crucified. Now here's the twist of mercy. He had their throats cut first, sparing them the slow agony of crucifixion. A gentleman even in vengeance. This pirate escapade was more than just a wild tale. It was a testament to Caesar's audacity and savvy, traits that would become his trademarks. His return to Rome was marked by a growing reputation that mixed fear with admiration, a cocktail perfect for a man destined to shake the foundations of the Republic. So, what do we take from this chapter of Caesar's life? Politics, marriages, and even kidnapping were all just stages for Caesar to showcase his unique flair for drama and cunning. His early career wasn't just about survival. It was a strategic chess game, where each move was calculated to build alliances, outmaneuver enemies, and inch closer to ultimate power. Stay tuned, because these early lessons in bravado and negotiation were just the opening act for Caesar's larger-than-life saga. With the swagger of a man who just outwitted the Mediterranean's fiercest sea dogs, Julius Caesar returned to Rome, his eyes set on a prize far greater than pirate plunder. He was poised for a different theater, one where the stakes were measured in legions and provinces rather than talents of silver. That theater was Gaul. When we talk about Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, we're discussing a series of military maneuvers on a scale that would make even the most grandiose Hollywood director blush. Now, let's not beat around the bush. Caesar's conquest of Gaul wasn't just about expanding Rome's borders. It was as much about filling his own coffers as it was about filling the pages of future history books. The Gallic Wars, which raged from 58 BC to 50 BC, were a masterclass in military logistics and propaganda. Caesar wrote his own accounts, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, which, to be fair, might as well have been titled How I Won Gaul and Why I'm Awesome. Spoiler alert. He made himself the hero of every chapter, every battle, and even his horse probably got a heroic mention. But let's dig into the nitty-gritty of why Gaul was such a tempting target. Economically, it was the ancient equivalent of a gold mine. The region was rich in resources, timber, metals, and most importantly, people. People who could be taxed, people who could be enslaved, and people who could be Romanized to bolster the empire's manpower. The Gallic tribes were fractured, and Caesar saw this division as both a challenge and an opportunity. If he could conquer Gaul, he could claim not only the land, but also the wealth it promised. Caesar's military campaigns were a logistical marvel. Picture this. He had to coordinate the movement of tens of thousands of troops across a sprawling, untamed landscape. We're talking about an area that covered modern-day France, Luxembourg, Belgium, most of Switzerland, and parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany. To move his legions, Caesar relied on a combination of roads, rivers, and sheer Roman engineering prowess. His armies could march up to 20 miles a day, a testament to both their discipline and the quality of Roman infrastructure. Now, let's talk troop movements. In 58 BC, Caesar had a standing army of about 4 legions, roughly 20,000 men. But he wasn't just about numbers. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to adapt and improvise. When faced with the Helvetii, a migrating tribe of some 368,000 people, Caesar didn't just rely on brute force. He used strategic positioning, blocking their path and forcing them into a disadvantageous battle. The result? A decisive Roman victory and a clear message. Caesar wasn't someone you could simply walk past. Then there's the Battle of the Sabis, where Caesar faced the Nervii, a fierce Gallic tribe. The Nervii had a reputation as warriors who fought to the death, no surrender, no retreat. In 57 BC, they ambushed Caesar's forces, catching them off guard. It was a bloodbath, with Roman soldiers barely having time to form proper lines. Yet in the chaos, Caesar himself took to the front, rallying his men and turning a potential rout into a stunning victory. The cost was high, with Roman casualties numbering in the thousands, but Gaul was slowly being brought to heel. Economic motivations aside, the Gallic Wars were also a public relations campaign. Caesar's writings portrayed the Gauls as barbaric, a threat to Roman civilization that needed taming. It was a narrative that sold well back in Rome, where the Senate and the people ate up tales of Roman valor against savage foes. Yet, behind the glorious tales of conquest, there were harsh realities. The financial toll on Roman resources was immense. Wars are expensive, and Caesar's campaigns were no exception. Armies needed to be fed, equipped, and paid. The Roman treasury felt the strain, and Caesar's ambitious plans often required him to secure loans and favors from Rome's wealthiest citizens. In the end, Caesar's Gallic campaigns were a double-edged sword. They cemented his reputation as a military genius and expanded Rome's territories significantly. However, they also set the stage for his eventual downfall. The Senate, wary of his growing power and popularity, began to see him as a threat. The economic burdens of sustained warfare also sowed seeds of discontent among Rome's political elite. So, what do we take from Caesar's Gallic escapades? They were a triumph of strategy and ambition, but also a reminder of the costs of empire building. Conquering Gaul wasn't just about the battles won or the lands annexed. It was about the stories told, the legends crafted, and the shadows they cast over Rome's future. As we peel back the layers of myth and glory, we're left with a complex tapestry of ambition, greed, and the relentless march of history. A story that, like Caesar himself, was larger than life and twice as audacious. Stay tuned as we unravel more of Caesar's saga, where the stakes only get higher and the plot twists sharper. And just like that, Caesar, with his conquests and charisma, was on the brink of another stage in his spectacular rise. A stage that would see him tango with the titans of Roman politics, Pompey and Crassus. We're talking about the first triumvirate, folks, a political ménage à trois that was as unstable as it was ambitious. You see, back in Rome, political landscape was a bit like an ancient soap opera, full of backstabbing, drama, and power plays. And Caesar, ever the savvy scriptwriter, knew exactly how to pen his own story. So, who were these guys Caesar was teaming up with? Let's start with Pompey, also known as Pompey the Great. He was the Roman equivalent of a rock star general, with a list of military victories that stretched longer than a senator's toga. Before Caesar, Pompey was Rome's golden boy, a man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates. Those pesky sea bandits who kidnapped Caesar, remember? Then we have Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and when I say wealthy, I mean Jeff Bezos-level rich. He made his fortune in real estate, slave trade, and believe it or not, fire departments. Yes, he famously bought burning buildings for a song, extinguished the flames, and sold them at a profit. Talk about a hot market strategy. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed the first triumvirate around 60 BC, a strategic alliance that wasn't even official, just a handshake and a wink kind of deal. This wasn't about friendship. It was about mutual gain. Pompey wanted land for his veterans. Crassus yearned for military glory, and Caesar, well, he wanted the consulship, the ultimate political prize. Together, they were like the Roman Avengers, each bringing something to the table that the others desperately needed. But why was this alliance even necessary? The Roman Senate, a grumpy old boys' club of aristocrats, was notoriously resistant to change. They saw Caesar's populist leanings, his championing of the common people, as a threat to their power. He was the poster boy for the populares, the political party that, ironically, was often led by the elite, but claimed to represent the masses. Caesar's populism was no mere fad. It was a strategic masterstroke. He knew that by winning the hearts of the plebs, he could undermine the Senate's authority and bolster his own. The triumvirate wasn't just a power play. It was a balancing act on a high wire of Roman politics. Picture Caesar juggling his populist image with the need to keep Pompey and Crassus on side. Not an easy feat when egos as large as the Roman Empire are involved. And then there was the Senate, which viewed the triumvirate with all the enthusiasm of a cat facing a bath. They saw it as a shadow government, an unholy alliance that threatened the Republic's very foundations. And they weren't wrong. Now, let's talk about the economic realities that fueled this political circus. Rome's economy was a beast with an insatiable appetite. Wars, expansion, and public works didn't come cheap. Caesar was acutely aware of this, and his populist tactics often involved promising the moon to the Roman people. Bread and circuses, anyone. His public projects and lavish games were designed to curry favor with the masses, but they were also a financial burden that required him to lean heavily on Crassus's deep pockets. In 59 BC, Caesar secured the consulship, a move that was as much about political maneuvering as it was about sheer audacity. He pushed through reforms that benefited Pompey and Crassus, such as land distributions and tax breaks, but not without a fight. The Senate, predictably, resisted, and Caesar, in a moment of trademark defiance, bypassed them by taking his case directly to the people. He even married his daughter Julia to Pompey to cement their alliance, a classic case of keeping your friends close and your political pawns closer. But here's the kicker. For all its power and potential, the triumvirate was about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Personal ambitions and grudges simmered beneath the surface. Crassus's jealousy of Pompey's military successes and Caesar's growing popularity was no secret. Pompey, for his part, was wary of Caesar's ever-expanding influence. And Caesar, he was playing a game of chess where each piece was both an ally and a potential rival. This uneasy alliance was put to the test when Caesar's term as consul ended, and he was granted a 5-year command in Gaul. The Senate, hoping to keep him out of Rome's political arena, inadvertently gave him the stage he needed to build his legend. The spoils from Gaul and the loyalty of his legions made Caesar more powerful than ever, and the Senate's attempts to curb his influence only stoked the fires of his ambition. So, what do we learn from the formation of the first triumvirate? It was a political masterstroke that leveraged personal ambition for collective gain, but it was also a ticking time bomb. Caesar's ability to navigate this landscape, balancing military glory with political reality, was nothing short of genius. Yet, as with all things Caesar, the seeds of triumph were also the seeds of future conflict. The triumvirate was a delicate dance of power, and in Rome, the music was about to change. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the saga of Julius Caesar, where the stakes get higher, the alliances more fragile, and the consequences more profound. As the triumvirate wobbled like a Roman chariot on a cobblestone street, Caesar stood at the cusp of destiny with the kind of confidence that could only come from a man who had once told pirates to raise his ransom. His command in Gaul was set to expire, and the Senate, in their infinite wisdom, or sheer paranoia, demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as an ordinary citizen. For Caesar, this was akin to asking a lion to trade its roar for a meow. The stakes, his political future and possibly his life. And so, we arrive at the infamous moment that would shake the foundations of the Roman Republic, the crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC. Now, this wasn't just a casual stroll over a quaint little river. The Rubicon was the Rubicon, a boundary that separated the province of Cisalpine Gaul from Italy proper. Crossing it with an army was considered an act of war against the Senate. Yet Caesar, ever the drama maestro, made this river crossing a theatrical moment for the ages. Picture him on the riverbank, cloak fluttering in the wind, as he utters the legendary words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. It was a gamble as bold as it was irreversible. The implications of this act were seismic. By defying the Senate's orders, Caesar wasn't just marching towards Rome, he was marching into history. The Roman Republic, which had stood for centuries, was about to undergo a trial by combat. The Senate, now in full panic mode, turned to Pompey, the once Sally-turned rival, to defend the Republic. But Caesar had a head start, and a devoted army that would follow him to the ends of the earth, or at least to the gates of Rome. The ensuing civil war was a spectacle of strategy and spectacle. Caesar, with his typical flair for the audacious, managed maneuvers that were equal parts genius and madness. Take the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. Facing Pompey's larger army, Caesar pulled off a masterstroke that would make any modern general swoon. Pompey, relying on his cavalry superiority, was caught off guard when Caesar hid a line of reserves to counter the cavalry attack. The result, Pompey's forces crumbled like a stale loaf of Roman bread, while Caesar's troops seized the day. But victory came at a cost, both to Caesar and the Republic. With each win, Caesar's power grew, and the Senate's influence waned. The economic toll of the Civil War was staggering. War isn't cheap, and neither is ruling an empire. The Roman economy, already strained by years of expansion and military campaigns, felt the pinch. Soldiers needed payment, and the loot from Gaul only went so far. Loans and financial favors became the currency of survival, and Caesar, ever the resourceful politician, leveraged these debts like a maestro conducting a symphony of silver and sword. Caesar's march through Italy wasn't just a military campaign. It was a public relations blitzkrieg. He skillfully painted himself as a liberator, a man of the people standing against the tyranny of the Senate. And let's face it, the Roman public, weary of endless power struggles and backroom deals, were more than willing to buy what he was selling. Bread and circuses, once again, proved irresistible. But beneath the surface of Caesar's victories lay the cracks of a republic buckling under the weight of its own contradictions. The Senate, stripped of its power, became a shadow of its former self. Meanwhile, Caesar's growing influence cast a long shadow over Rome, one that couldn't be ignored. His dictatorship, later formalized in 44 BC, was both a testament to his genius and a satire of Roman ideals. The man who once stood for the populist cause now wielded power akin to a king, a title that was anathema to Roman sensibilities. And speaking of satire, the Roman elite, never ones to miss an opportunity for a jab, whispered tales of Caesar's ambition and the irony of his rule. His famous clemency, sparing enemies, instead of executing them, was both a political strategy and a source of comedic fodder. Caesar's mercy, they'd say with wry smiles, was the kind that left a man alive but powerless, a fate worse than death for Rome's aristocrats. So, what do we glean from this chapter of Caesar's life? It's a story of audacity and ambition, where the lines between hero and villain blur like the edges of a well-thumbed scroll. The crossing of the Rubicon wasn't just a physical act, it was a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Caesar, with his strategic brilliance and flair for the dramatic, reshaped Rome in his image, an image that was as captivating as it was controversial. And as the dust settled over the battlefield and the echoes of Alia Iacta Est faded into history, Rome found itself on the brink of transformation. The Republic, once a bastion of shared power, was morphing into an empire ruled by the will of one man. The Civil War had ended, but the real battle, between the ideals of the Republic and the reality of Caesar's rule, was just beginning. Stay tuned, because the saga of Julius Caesar is far from over. The plot thickens, the stakes rise, and the echoes of history reverberate with every choice made and every battle fought. In the grand tapestry of Rome, Caesar was weaving a story that would outlast marble statues and crumbling temples, a story of power, politics, the relentless march of one man towards immortality. The echoes of Caesar's decisive crossing of the Rubicon still reverberate through history, but the stage was set for his final act, a drama that would redefine power in Rome. Fast forward to March 1544 BC, the Ides of March, a day that would become synonymous with betrayal, political intrigue, and a timeless warning against hubris. Caesar, by then the dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life, was at the zenith of his power. Yet, as history has shown us time and again, absolute power often comes with an expiration date. Caesar's assassination wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment coup by a handful of disgruntled senators. No, it was a meticulously orchestrated affair, a who's who of the Roman elite who fancied themselves as liberators of the Republic. Among them were Brutus and Cassius, names that would forever be etched in the annals of betrayal. Brutus, in particular, was a close friend, and in a twist worthy of a Greek tragedy, rumored to be Caesar's illegitimate son. Nothing spices up a political conspiracy like a potential family drama. Now, let's talk numbers. Caesar was stabbed 23 times, but ironically only one wound, the second stab to his chest, was deemed fatal. The other 22, overkill, quite literally. As the knives descended upon him in the theater of Pompey, a venue that had seen its share of drama, Caesar reportedly uttered the famous line, "Et tu, brute," though historians debate whether he actually said it or if it was a later addition to spice up the narrative. Even in death, Caesar couldn't escape the theatrics. So why did these senators, the so-called liberators, turn on Caesar? Was it purely a noble cause to save the Republic, or was there a healthy dose of self-preservation and ego involved? Spoiler, it was a bit of both. The Senate, which had been sidelined by Caesar's unprecedented accumulation of power, saw the assassination as a way to reclaim their lost influence. But this wasn't just about politics. It was about fear. The fear that Caesar would dismantle the Republic and crown himself king, a title as welcome in Rome as a toga at a nudist colony. But here's the kicker. The assassination didn't save the Republic. Rather, it plunged Rome into chaos, setting off a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the rise of the empire. Talk about unintended consequences. The immediate aftermath was a smorgasbord of confusion and violence. Caesar's funeral, orchestrated by his loyal ally Mark Antony, turned into a public spectacle. Antony's eulogy, a masterclass in emotional manipulation, whipped the Roman populace into a frenzy, turning them against the assassins. The streets of Rome, once echoing with the sounds of commerce and debate, now reverberated with cries for vengeance. In the power vacuum left by Caesar's death, a new political alliance emerged, the Second Triumvirate. This time, it was Antony, Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, and Lepidus who teamed up to hunt down the assassins and seize control. And hunt they did, with the precision of a Roman legion on a warpath. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BC saw the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, marking the end of the so-called liberators and the beginning of a new order, one that would see Octavian, later Augustus, become the first emperor of Rome. Now, let's untangle the myth from the reality of Caesar's legacy. The romanticized version paints him as a visionary leader who dared to cross lines, literally and figuratively, to reshape Rome. But the reality is more complex. Yes, Caesar was a military genius and a shrewd politician, but he was also a man who played fast and loose with the Republic's traditions. His reforms, such as the Julian calendar and debt relief laws, were undeniably impactful, yet they were also self-serving, designed to consolidate his power and win public favor. Economically, Caesar's reign was a mixed bag. His military campaigns, while enormously successful, drained the treasury and left Rome with a hefty debt. He famously cancelled a quarter of all debts, a move that endeared him to debtors but infuriated creditors. And let's not forget the lavish public games and feasts he threw to keep the populace entertained, an ancient version of bread and circuses, but with a hefty price tag. So, why does Caesar's story still captivate us today? Perhaps it's the sheer audacity of his life, a narrative that combines ambition, betrayal, and genius in equal measure. Or maybe it's the cautionary tale of power's seductive allure and the perils of overreach. His life and death echoed through the corridors of history, leaving a legacy that shaped the Roman Empire, and by extension, the Western world. In the grand tapestry of history, Caesar is both a hero and a cautionary tale. His story reminds us that the pursuit of power is often a double-edged sword, where triumph and tragedy walk hand in hand. The Roman Empire that followed was built on the foundations he laid, for better or worse. And as we look back, we find that history, much like Caesar himself, is larger than life, full of lessons and legends that continue to resonate. In the end, Caesar's assassination was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of an empire. It was a moment that transcended the political machinations of the day and became a symbol of the delicate balance between power and principle. And as we ponder his legacy, we are reminded that history's greatest figures are often as flawed as they are fascinating, leaving us with stories that endure long after the swords have been sheathed and the dust has settled.